Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today we are continuing on with the Shroud Wars series. Like it feels like it's been over a month. I think the last show I did, I had Jack Markward on covering the Shroud history. But today we're switching back to the science and the question of image formation. In particular, we're looking at the powder rubbing mechanisms and Hugh Farey's Quem Quaeritis mechanisms to see how does this ordinary artistic mechanism hold up in terms of explaining all of the Shroud's features. And joining me, I have got a full panel here. So immediately to my left, we have the Shroud skeptic, Hugh Farey. Hey, Hugh. Do you have any
Hi
news
there.
for us? Take a couple minutes. Do you have any news for us? What have you been working on and stuff?
Well, no, just recently because of this upcoming show. Oh, apart from losing my voice, which you probably can hear. Um, yes, I've been playing with my microscope and tea leaves and all sorts of interesting things.
Gotcha, gotcha. All right, and immediately to my bottom, Mark Guscin returns. This is your third time on the show, so welcome back, Mark. And yeah,
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be back here talking about the Shroud again.
awesome. And out of curiosity, because I think it's been a while since you were on, what have you been up to on your end? Anything interesting or?
Well, I've what I'm doing is something I've been working on now for 3 years. I thought it would take me about 18 months. It's a book in an previously unpublished text in Latin, medieval Latin, by a priest at the Vatican who, in the early 17th century, wrote a book about the Veronica, the icon of the Veronica, every single thing he could find in the Vatican archives about it. And it's going to be a critical edition, which is why it's taken me so long, because there are 8 manuscripts, and you have to check every word in every one to produce the critical edition and everything. Then translate it, then write an introduction. So 3 years down the road, I reckon it's going to take me another 2 years, but it takes up it takes up just about all my time.
Awesome.
So that's
Yeah,
what I've been doing.
sounds good. Yeah, I know Jack will be excited because he's really impressed with your scholarship and your book that you did before at an academic level and stuff like that. So yeah, can't wait for that. And then finally joining me, we have Teddy Pappas. And Teddy, I think the last time you were on the show was for it was for the Barry Schwartz tribute. But what have you been up to on your end? How's your book coming along and stuff like that?
I've taken a bit of a detour on the book. I did an expanded version of a paper that I wrote for the BSTS newsletter on rigor mortis this past summer, and I've just done an expanded version on that that gets into a little bit more evidence, some new evidence that I found on cadaveric spasm, but also gives a lot of gives a very in-depth introduction and a historic background on some key points of crucifixion in the Roman Empire, and I'm hoping to get that published soon. That we're in the process of that, so hopefully I'll have some news soon with that paper. But bouncing around. As anybody who knows me very well knows that I go down rabbit holes on a very regular basis. Like I start writing one sentence and I might go down two rabbit holes to produce one sentence. So things are going very slowly with my book, but
Fair
uh,
enough.
I can sympathize with what Mark is talking about. It just takes forever. People were saying that, what was it, Mark Antonacci, the other Mark, was saying people were ribbing him about how it took him something like 10 years to write his book. And I don't know, I'm probably going down the Antonacci, Gary Habermas track. So we'll see. I'm doing my best. But I'll tell you, Socrates was right. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know, and how much there is to know. And like I said, it puts me down endless numbers of rabbit holes.
All right, awesome. So, all right, with that said, I do want to get straight into this topic. So I want to make sure we get Mark's take on as much as possible here. So the first thing I want to do is kind of look at our first category of ordinary artistic mechanism. And this is the powder rubbing or frottage method. Starting with people like the skeptic Joe Nickell, but specifically, I want to focus on the best of this category, Luigi Garlaschelli and his 2009 experiments and stuff like that. So, just as a quick little primer, I'm going to just share my screen because this is, I think, the most popular of all the Shroud skeptic theories. So you can see even the atheist Pine Creek Doug goes for it. So I'll just play a quick little clip of him here.
This image has been up the whole time, Dale, and this is a fake. This was made by a guy.
Yeah, that looks like Garlaschelli's image.
This is made from a guy in the Smithsonian. He just very quickly recreated it. He's not an artist. He very quickly took some mercuric sulfide, and he had like a mold of a face. You can do the whole body. And he take a little tiny sponge. He went and then he put in the oven for 6 hours, and voila, you got the Shroud of Turin.
Okay, so this is the atheist Pine Creek Doug claiming that Luigi Garlaschelli, this is his image that he got. Well, he very quickly reproduced the Shroud images, no problem, and stuff like that. I think some of us are going to be begging to differ here, but just before we get into assessing his theory, I just want to go around to the panelists and kind of give in, 6 to 8 minutes or something like that. Can you guys explain what is Luigi Garlaschelli's technique and what do you make of it? So Teddy, I'll start with you on this one.
I'm sure start with the person that came in at the last minute. But anyway, so with Garlaschelli, he was using a dauber, and he actually, I think Pine Creek Doug was wrong. He wasn't using mercuric sulfide. I believe he was using a cobalt colored pigment. And I think at one point he may have used red ochre. Again, I'm coming into this show at the last minute, but from what I remember, there's still problems with you would have to account for the pigment. He initially put the pigment, and he tried putting solids of acid mixed in with the pigment, but he realized that unless the acids or salts were liquid, like put into an aqueous solution, they wouldn't cause the type of dehydration and oxidation that we see in the Shroud. Garlaschelli does acknowledge actually that the Shroud's image is not due to any pigment, which is a great admission. He acknowledges that the image is due to dehydration and oxidation of the cellulose itself. And so, I mean, already he's a lot of the ways there to realize what's there. But he talks about how when he put the cloth over a real body, and then they dabbed it with the dauber with the pigment so they could see where they're putting everything. He talked about how he realized how difficult it is to get an even application of even the pigment, and if you were to do this with just pure acid, how difficult it is to get an even application with the acid. The problem is when he used the powder, he got more of the fuzzy outline that we see with the Shroud's body image, because we know that there's no outline with the Shroud, and the oddness with the shroud where you have to step away about a meter in order to see it, yet at about 30 feet, you don't see it. So you also have to account for that odd aspect of the shroud. But Garlaschelli was talking about how with the when he was just using dry powder without any type of binder, he, at least in his mind, achieved sort of that fuzzy outline where there wasn't a harsh outline. But there was the problem of, the sediment, the powder itself, and we know from the X-ray fluorescence and the X-ray radiography that there is no pigment. And nothing of a high metal that is accounting for the body image. It's like what Dr. Alan Adler always was talking about with the Beer-Lambert law, how the issue of necessary and sufficient, if you're going to say that this is a painting or something that is an image that's created with pigment, then you have to show that there is enough pigment to account for the image that is seen. Some people will say that the X-ray fluorescence was not sensitive enough. Problem is that the X-ray fluorescence and X-ray radiography, those were sensitive enough to detect invisible iron that was all over the shroud, uniformly spread, gotten onto the cloth itself through the retting process of flax to create the linen cloth. So if the machines were sensitive enough to pick up on invisible iron, then logically they have to be sensitive enough to pick up on iron that is visibly detectable. So, so Garlaschelli then moved on from the whole dabbing, kind of like the Craig and Breesy dabbing business with iron oxide, or then with the cobalt blue pigment. He then moves on to using a slurry where he's got the pigment so you could see where the acid is being applied. And I think he was using sulfuric acid, if I remember correctly. And so he did get some etching, but the problem is that when you remove, I mean, so if somebody is going to create the shroud applying acid, how are they going to know precisely where to put it unless it's pigmented? Um, and then if it's got pigment in it with this colored slurry, then how are you going to remove it all to where people like Heller and Adler and the X-ray fluorescence and the X-ray radiography, how would they not pick it up? Or just even through simple microscopy, how would that not be picked up? Because you're going to see, there's just no way that somebody is going to be able to wash, especially a 14-foot by 3.5-foot cloth so well to where they remove all traces of the pigment. So Garlaschelli also employs the use of artificial aging. And that's very problematic because the more I read about artificial aging, the less impressed I get with it, because there are all sorts of problems with it.
And Teddy, just to wrap this point up, and then I want to go to Mark. So, like, in a minute or so.
Sure, but even Garlaschelli talks about the problems of artificial aging. So he acknowledges that. He acknowledges that his slurry gives a very uneven image because it creates too much of a wrapping distortion and it creates harsh lines and not the blurred edges. So honestly, Garlaschelli is sinking his own hypothesis, and he presumes that there is some sort of a catalytic, agent such as an acid in the original red ochre, and he thinks that that's that the remnants of that are what caused the etching or the dehydration and oxidation of the cellulose. Yet, if you've got, for example, red ochre doing that, that's more like foxing, and foxing on cellulose tends to grow over time, yet the body image on the shroud has not grown or become distorted over time, as we can see from prior attempts at drawing or painting it from, the medieval times. So anyway, that's just a
Awesome.
quick.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much there, Teddy. I appreciate
Sure.
that. And now, Mark, I want to turn to you. Same question. Give kind of in about 6 to 8 minutes or so, your opening as to what your understanding of Garlaschelli's method is and what's your take on how it performs. Oh, we're not hearing you. Mark, did Teddy put you to sleep with
Sorry,
her?
it's for me.
No, bro, sorry. I so I don't know if you heard. I was just saying I was turning it over to you for the next 6 to 8 minutes or so, same as Teddy, to give your take on what Garlaschelli's method is and
Yeah,
what is your
sure.
take on it. Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me just say that some years ago, I actually met Garlaschelli with his Shroud mock-up in Italy when I was filming a documentary with the National Geographic. Okay. And two interesting things to say about that. A, this is purely a subjective opinion, this first part, but his product of the shroud, to my mind, just looked like one of the numerous medieval copies of the shroud. Didn't look anything like it, like the original. It looked like a copy. And then, secondly, I asked him directly about the blood stains, and he said, "Oh yeah, first I did the body, and then I put the blood stains on the top of it. How was I going to put the blood stains on first?" And that, again, just like means the whole thing is wrong. You cannot take that into account. If somebody is going to reproduce the shroud, reproduce anything, not only the shroud, but any object, it has to reproduce every single aspect, every single property that the original, in this case, shroud object in general, has. And automatically, just with the thing of the blood stains, saying, how was I going to put them on before doing the body? Is like saying, okay, that's the end of that then. Your copy is not a valid copy. Therefore, the methodology that you have come up with does not, it's quite ingenious, but it does not give us an explanation as to how the image on the Shroud of Turin was formed. No matter what that image is or isn't, no matter when the shroud dates from, Garlaschelli's reproduction is just another copy, the same as so many that you can see all over Europe. And I do believe there are some in the United States as well. But it is not an explanation of how the original shroud image was formed. And that is not a statement either in favor or against authenticity. It's a purely scientific, artistic statement that I would find very difficult to argue with, because he himself admitted that he hadn't followed the order of events that we do know took place when the Shroud of Turin image was formed. So, I think he's getting way too much publicity for having painted a copy of the Shroud. Not an explanation. And he admitted as much to me in person.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Mark. And I'll just say, yeah, there are apparently videos when he was at a panel admitting that his Obviously, for privacy reasons, they can't be shown because they're not publicly available. But he fully admits that his method is insufficient, apparently. So, but yeah, but that said, I want to go straight to you, Hugh. And now is the time for your kind of uninterrupted opening for about 6 to 8 minutes. Same questions. What is your understanding of Garlaschelli's method? What is it? And what's your general take on it?
Right. Well, I think first of all, people who like to think that the Shroud is not authentic have taken Garlaschelli's experiments as quite often to be the definitive answer to the authenticist claim, which is not what Garlaschelli ever claimed himself. He was experimenting with possible ways in which the Shroud could have been produced in the Middle Ages. And he tried several ways, some of which worked in some characteristics and some of which worked in others. But he never at any point claims that he has decided that he has found out how the Shroud was made. In fact, he particularly goes out of his way in his, I've got his document here, what's it called? The life-size reproduction of the Shroud of Turin and its image, to say he hasn't definitively explained exactly how it was. What he's done is, like myself later on, as you'll see, is come up with various arguments or various methods by which we might continue to explore how to get a more and more precise reproduction of the Shroud as we see it. He begins, I mean, he the very beginning of his paper is not, I'm trying to prove by my experiments that the Shroud is medieval. He is assuming from the start that the Shroud is medieval. And he's going from there to say, if the Shroud is medieval, how was it done? And that, of course, is how I've been going about it. Now, he came up with all sorts of interesting ideas, which were probably based on things that Joe Nickell came up with. And some of them are based on, I think, unnecessary debunking of some rather naive ideas about image formation that sort of emerged in the mid-1970s and have never really gone away. Even now, you'll find people, none of us present, I may say, who will begin a lecture on the authenticity of the Shroud with things like, there are no brushstrokes and therefore it's not a painting. When this kind of thing has been considered absurd for nearly 50 years. Of course, there are no brushstrokes, so certainly agree with that. But then huge numbers of paintings have no brushstrokes. And then we go on to all sorts of other things. And I'm afraid I'll do this in more detail later on. But the whole concept of superficiality is entirely irrelevant. Almost all paintings are entirely superficial in all sorts of aspects. So trying to debunk things which had sort of been perhaps in his mind established as something which had to be got rid of was part of the urge to go down this, well, let's do it with daubing. Now, and by daubing, he used a sort of medieval method of pouncing, which was basically to get a bag full of pigment and dab it onto a cloth. And in order to do that, the cloth is draped over. Well, he tried draping it over a person, and he found that for most of the image on the Shroud, actually using a real person was adequate. You just didn't dab it down the sides, but he found that didn't work at all for the face, and so he used a bas relief for the face. But as you'll see from my own presentation later on, I see no reason why they didn't use a bas relief for the whole thing. And then, of course, he came up with two conflicting ideas, and these were the ones which Tybalt Heimberger investigated. Again, talking to Garlaschelli, who freely said, yes, this is a problem that I had. And that is that if you use something that's really damp, like a sponge or something like that, you either make contact or you don't, basically. And if you do that, then the shading that you get from the image that you make is pretty poor, because the wet bits produce the sort of top level layer and the dry bits don't. Exactly as an early woodblock print would do. You get bits which are either black or white, and there's nothing in between. However, if you use a dry powder, which was his other technique, then of course you do get subtleties of pressure. You get dark bits over the top, and you get lighter bits where the pressure is less, or in the dimples in between the prominences. And so you get something which responds to the 3D version, using the image analyzer. It looks much more like a representation of a 3D bas relief than it would have been otherwise. But he never really reconciled those two. And I think the trouble was, I suspect he was sponsored by somebody. I don't think anybody serious wanting to reproduce the Shroud from an artistic technique point of view would bother to cut out burn holes in their reproduction. That seems to be unnecessarily populist, and that sort of thing. I think what we're looking for is how was the image made. So that's roughly my take on Garlaschelli, and I think, I mean, I've been corresponding with him recently, and he's enjoyed being a bit of a showman, and he's not just a showman in terms of the Shroud of Turin. He's been a member of the Italian version of Psy-Cop for some time, and I dare say he's gone into other things as well, though I haven't pursued that. But so making his Shroud complete with its scourge marks and bloodstains and scorch marks and all that sort of thing seems to me a bit of a red herring. However, what I would unfortunately take issue with Mark's idea, and that is that I simply don't accept that the blood was put on before the image. I don't think that's true, and I don't think there's sufficient evidence for it. I don't think anybody's actually come up with any evidence for it, except for some rather peculiar observations made by Heller and Adler of fibers which they found on the sticky tape slides, which were not observed by the only other people who also examined them, which were Eugenia Nickowski and Joseph Kolbeck, who specifically said, we looked for the deterioration that Heller and Adler said they'd found, and we didn't find it. So, I mean, I think that's got to be a moot point, and it's certainly not one that someone who's attempting to reproduce the Shroud needs to start with as a fundamental before they carry on with any other process.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right.
I think that's just about all I got to say, really. I mean, I could answer some questions if any, but I think, hang on, have we got anything?
Well, I think
oh, no, I'll do one more thing, because I think,
okay,
sorry.
But just try to wrap up in about a minute, just to be fair to everyone else. So that'll be your second.
Yes. No, it's just, this one was related to the idea, the artificial aging thing, which Teddy has a problem with. I too have a problem with that. I don't think that the people who manufactured the Shroud did any sort of artificial aging process. And I think that although certainly the Shroud as we have it now is almost certainly not very much like it was when it was first made, I think there is a bit tricky about saying, right, well, let's artificially age it by a couple of 100 years. But while I was working on my own experiments, I found that I didn't artificially age the Shroud. But what I did do was, while I was washing off all the pigment, which I think can be done and has to be done quite thoroughly, but there's still plenty of pigment left behind, as I've shown. in the previous blogcast, the cloth as it came out of the washing machine is unbelievably wrinkled. So, of course, what did I do with it? I ironed it. And I think that that's exactly what they would have done in the Middle Ages. It came out of whatever the washing process was. I mean, they could have hung it over probably did, hung it over a line to dry. But after that, it may still have residual wrinkles. And so they ironed it with what in the medieval times was a flat iron. And that may have produced some of the artificial aging that, but was simply coincidentally, that Garlaschelli tried to produce by deliberately, I don't know, bunging his thing in an oven or something like that. Yes, he had a special aging machine, which was a kind of large tubular oven. So I think that might account for the artificial aging, but there's a little bit more which we can add as we go along, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah. So we will transition into the informal dialogue portion, but just before we do, I just wanted to clarify something that Hugh kind of briefly mentioned. So in the first place, so Joe Nickell was the first skeptic to come up with the dry powder rubbing mechanism. That has been falsified thoroughly. I think all three of us would agree with that much. And even Joe Nickell.
I think Macron gets that honor.
Yeah, Macron also falsified it, right, with the snow fencing technique.
Yeah, Macron was the first to have the Chicago artist Walter Sanford do a copy of Shroud's, numerous copies of the Holy Face, and they tried to do the powder rubbing, finger painting thing. So with powder, and Macron immediately.
You're right. Yeah. So
Nickell doesn't get that. And Macron got to give it to Macron.
Okay. All right, fair. You are correct. Yeah, I remember you said that. So apart from that little correction, though, so the point is the theory that Nickell goes for is utterly falsified. And even Nickell himself admits that Garlaschelli's technique that we've been talking about is a far superior method. Now, here's the problem. Hugh kind of mentioned with Garlaschelli's technique, he doesn't have one single method. You know, he gets certain results from one set of experiments and then other results from other set of experiments, and these contradict. I think Hugh mentioned one point where they contradict, right? It can't be amalgamated into a single technique. That said, if we're going to cheat, I'm going to just share my screen here this comes from Mark Antonacci, just to help the audience have some kind of understanding. Again, this isn't technically correct because Garlaschelli has two different techniques that contradict, but I'm trying to fudge the data as best I can to come up with one single method. So here it is. So step one, a pigment containing acidic compounds, sulfuric acid, in a water-based slurry was rubbed on a prepared linen cloth, molded over a human model, and specifically for the face, the bas-relief, right? But the human model was used for both the frontal and the dorsal images below the neck level. Step two, a shallow bas-relief was constructed out of plaster of Paris for the facial image, and that's why you have the frottage, meaning French, meaning rubbing, was used to obtain the basic raw image. Garlaschelli reported that although a shroud-like image can be produced by a rubbing technique on a human body, the face must be obtained from a bas-relief to avoid the inescapable wraparound distortion. So he's having to use a human torso for the body images and then a bas-relief for the face. Next, the sharp-bordered scourge marks were added with a paintbrush and that sort of thing. The cloth was artificially aged, as we've been talking about. It was heated and that sort of thing and ironed flat. And then step five is finally the major bloodstains were painted on using the traditional painting technique, and he also used a blowtorch to put on the burn marks from the 1532 fire. So that's just to help the audience get some kind of idea as to what Garlaschelli's method would be if we were trying to make it coherent. But at this point, I want to turn it over to the panelists to have an informal discussion. For the first part of the discussion, let's take away the aspect about the chemistry debate. What, is there paint on it? We'll come to that next. But what about the physical features? So the three-dimensionality, superficiality, uniformity, vertical mapping, that sort of thing. How do you guys think Garlaschelli's method performs on that front? And Mark, I'll kick it to you to start off the informal dialogue and let you guys go for the next, 20
Well,
minutes, 25 minutes.
I mean, after what, everyone's just said, I really don't see too much point in discussing Garlaschelli's work, because if he wasn't out to try and explain how the shroud image was formed, then I don't really know quite what everyone thinks he was doing. Of course, he was trying to explain how the shroud image was formed. That was the commission that he'd been given, and he couldn't do it. What Hugh said, in a way, it's one of those things that I don't think is ever going to be solved in any shroud discussion, where you get on one extreme, you've got people who are really fanatic about the shroud. It proves the resurrection, it proves the Christian and or Catholic faith, and anything that they come across that doesn't quite fit in with that, they just tend to discard it, which is exactly what Hugh's done from his point of view. He doesn't like the idea that the blood was put on the cloth before the image, which is a proven fact. And so he just says, well, no, it isn't. So there's not a lot that you can actually, get into a discussion about there. I think everybody needs everybody needs to be a bit more reasonable about what they affirm, what they state. Hugh, how could you explain the fact that there's no image under the bloodstain? How can you explain the fact that on the shroud there is no chemical alteration? Let me finish. No chemical alteration of the fibers. In other words, none of this chemical alteration that forms the image underneath the bloodstain. The bloodstains in the plural on the shroud.
There's absolutely minimal evidence for that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. If you'd like to quote the words of Heller and Adler, they talk specifically about a kind of corrosion that they see on the surface of the fibers. And this kind of corrosion was not observed and was looked for and found wasn't there by two other people who were also keen on the authenticity of the shroud. So I can't say that it was or it wasn't, and I won't declare that it is a proven fact that the blood was there after the image. I wouldn't say that, but I think it would be very wrong to declare that it was a proven fact that the blood was there before the image.
It's about. Sorry, Teddy. You go ahead, Teddy.
Oh, I was going to say, Giulio Fanti observed the corrosion. He's got a different term for, I know he doesn't like the word corrosion because I always use that word. He's got a different word, but it's synonymous with it. But he has observed the basically what Heller and Adler observed in terms of where underneath those fibers are altered, and they also tend to be, when you look at body image fibers, they're shorter, they're more brittle, and when Heller and Adler, with the, what was it, the protease treatment, when they removed blood from a fiber and they saw it in pristine condition in the same way as the non-image fibers, then that tells us that Kelly Kearse's hypothesis that in Kelly, I don't know that it didn't seem like he actually was buying his own and he was just throwing it out there as hey, this is something that's possible. He wasn't necessarily endorsing it, but he was saying, oh, well, what if there was something mixed into the blood that caused whatever created the body image to go away.
But that's a hypothesis that nobody's ever going to be able to prove.
Well, but the thing is the beautiful thing is that, okay, let's just assume that there's something in the blood that got rid of the body image. If whatever was so corrosive as to create the body image was on there first and then the blood on top, and then the blood gets rid of the body image, we should have underneath that the corrosion, the damaged fibers that are caused by the body image. When Heller and Adler, they talk about how they were able to reverse the color. I mean, they tried using hydrazine and dimite. I'm trying to remember now. Uh, and that didn't, or was it oxidant? I'm trying to remember now. They tried to a bunch of things to get rid of color, and what they managed to do is when they were able to reverse the color to, like, in the image areas where it's yellow, and they brought it back to a normal color. The problem is that even if you reverse the color, you can't reverse the damage. You can't magically, with chemistry, return a damaged fiber into an undamaged fiber. You can't turn a short, brittle fiber back into a restored fiber. It doesn't, that part of things is not reversible. And so even though the color could be, you still have the problem of the damaged fibers. Uh, and I'll say one thing too. I don't know that, I know Hughes mentioned the thing about Natowski, where she didn't say anything about the corrosion, but I don't think Kolbeck said that. And I'm not sure exactly what Natowski said, but all I know is that Natowski didn't, she's not a scientist. She's not a microscopist, whereas Heller and Adler uh, were, experts with that sort of thing. And I just don't. I remember Barry was critical of some of Natowski's findings as well. But when if it comes down to who are you trusting, Natowski or Heller and Adler? Heller and Adler, they were so persistent because they were so acutely aware that whatever they were going to write was going to be challenged by everyone, and that they were going to be hyper scrutinized, that they were constantly, and I think Heller especially, a lot of times Adler would think that something was good enough, and it probably was, but Heller would say, no, that's not good enough. We need to do this and that and make sure we've just got checkmate on these issues. And so we have no indication that Natowski had that personality trait.
All right, yeah, Mark. So I know that you were trying to get in there as well. So I just want to make sure you have time to respond to that issue, and then I've got a question as well. Oh, yeah, Mark. Mark, you were trying to say something. Go ahead.
So I keep losing the sound as well here. What's the question, Dale?
Oh no, I was just saying that I think before you wanted to respond to what Hugh was saying on the no blood underneath the body images. So I just wanted to give you the final word on that,
well,
and then I was going to ask a new question.
I mean, that in itself is a fact, that there is no body image under the blood. And I think this is a question of, okay, there can be all kinds of ideas about why that should be. I don't think you can deny that that's the case. And normally the thing that you do is apply the Occam's razor thing. What's the most simple, most logical reason for that? Well, the fact that the blood was already there, and whatever formed the image couldn't do it or didn't do it through the blood. That seems quite logical. And again, I don't see why, even as a Shroud skeptic, there should be a problem with that. That doesn't mean that the Shroud is real. It doesn't mean it's authentic. Doesn't mean it's first century. Just means that there is no body image under the blood. And if you're going to try and reproduce the Shroud image, that's something you have to take into account. And if you don't, then it's a failed experiment.
Gotcha.
I don't see what I know where you're coming from. I know how you think, but I don't see how that particular fact can represent a problem for any Shroud skeptic.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well,
Right,
of course.
Go ahead and respond, Hugh.
Well, I don't. I have in front of me a database here. I have 518 sticky tape slide photographs. So I don't know whether you have access to these things, but I have seen 518 photographs of the sticky tape slides in close-up at magnifications of between times 40 and times 100. So I'm in a position to say that looks corroded or that doesn't look corroded, and I'm in no worse a position than anybody else, including Heller and Adler. All they could see was what they saw through the microscope, took photographs, except that they didn't take any photographs, so we can't judge whether what they defined as corroded or not corroded.
And in those images, in those 518 images that you've seen, is there anything there to suggest that there is a body image under the blood?
Yes.
Yes, there is.
Yes, and that is because I think there's a sort of idea for those who've never seen any of these things that a blood image fiber contains somehow a fiber with a kind of sheath of blood over the top, which simply isn't true. It isn't there at all. The blood, such as it is, appears either particulate or in kind of like flakes wrapped around the shroud, wrapped around the fiber.
Yeah.
And the fibers themselves can be of assorted different colors, so that the color of the fiber, the color of a blood fiber, which doesn't exactly have a little wraparound sleeve of blood over it, is exactly the same color as another image fiber from elsewhere. You see, the idea that there is such a thing as an image fiber or a blood fiber or a non-image fiber, these are myths. These are complete myths and have to be taken seriously.
How can you say that it's... So you're saying that
because it's so important.
A non-image fiber is exactly the same as an image fiber.
I'm saying that the distinction between them is very difficult to make. You see, the idea is that somehow you can take, look, that's an image fiber because it's got a color on it. That's a blood fiber because it's got blood on it. That's a non-image fiber because it hasn't. This is not the way these fibers appear on the sticky tape.
So why can we see an image and why can we see blood?
Good, because there is a predominance of this or that kind of particulate or staining in a particular area of fibers. Now, the trouble with the sticky tape fibers is that they were dabbed down with such a weak force deliberately, and I mean, thank goodness, perhaps it was a good thing for them, that they did not extract much more than surface debris off the shroud. And that surface debris consisted of all sorts of things. And in some of my blogs, I've posted almost exactly the same set of three slides, set of three fibers from non-image, from image, from bloodstain, and even from the Holland tape. The same kind of fiber appears on all of them. And the only way we can decide whether this is from a blood area is whether there is more of this kind of fiber or less of this kind of fiber in that particular area than not. So even image fibers, as is well known, the image only goes down 2 or 3 fibers into each thread. So if you extract any fibers at all from below the image, then of course your sticky tape contains non-image fibers from underneath the image. It contains image fibers from on top of the image. Most of the blood, as you can see just by looking at the shroud, or even the Mark Evans's pictures, almost all the blood is worn off anyway.
But you can still see it. So I don't see how
you can
possibly say that the fibers are the same color and everything, because if that was true, then we wouldn't see an image and we wouldn't see any blood. But we do.
So Hugh, let me just step back.
And you can see chunks of blood. What we're looking at is you're seeing things when you look at the whole shroud. You see a completely different scenario from when you're looking at individual fibers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
but those individual fibers necessarily must be different to produce what you're calling, I don't know, the effect of an image. I mean, if I look at the shroud and I see an image, then obviously those fibers are different from a non-image fiber. Of course they are. Otherwise you wouldn't see an image. And if a fiber has blood, be it flakes, be it blood impregnated into the fibers, whatever, the blood is there. So it doesn't, those fibers are not the same as a non-blood fiber.
So I just want to step in. Okay, so
otherwise you wouldn't see the blood.
Guys, I'm going to step in. Because I see that Teddi did want to say something a while back, so I want to give her the last word again, restrain it. But before I do, Mark, you were the one that raised the issue of no blood under, no body images under the blood. Can you just explain briefly what is the relevance to Garlaschelli's hypothesis? Like, why should we care? How does that falsify or verify Garlaschelli's hypothesis if there's no body?
Well, if he. The point is, if you put the blood stains on before the image, no matter how the image was produced, you've got to have a very, very accurate eye to be able to do that and think, okay, here's where I'm going to paint or produce or whatever your word you wish to use, the wrists. Here's where the head's going to go. You have to get the distances just right. You have to get the proportions just right. And that is, I wouldn't say impossible, but virtually impossible to first paint or put the bloodstains on. And after that, make the image coincide with them, still being a perfectly proportioned image, which Garlaschelli himself told me. Obviously, I couldn't put the bloodstains on before the image because then I wouldn't get the image right.
Gotcha.
That's what he told me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So Teddi, in about 5 minutes, I saw that you wanted to respond to something Hugh was saying that they were debating there. And after you give your response in 5 minutes or less, I want to change it to a new topic.
Sure. First of all, from what I'm recalling, Heller and Adler, when they noticed the corrosive aspect of the threads that were underneath the blood when they removed the blood with the protease treatment. They noticed that under phase contrast microscopy. And I've got, Barry had sent me what you've got, all those Kolbeck and Natowski tapes. I've looked at some of them. I haven't had a chance to look at all of them. He sent them to me, I don't know, 10 months ago, a little bit, not too long before he passed away. But I don't remember if there were any of those images that were done with phase contrast, but I seem to recall that was how when they noticed it. But like I said, Giulio Fanti also noticed this the fact that the body image fibers have a different look to them. They're damaged, they're brittle, they're dehydrated, they're oxidized. And even Garlaschelli admits to that. He sees that there's a difference and acknowledges that there's a difference between the body image fibers and the non-image fibers. And that's why he went with the acid route, because he recognized image is not created through pigment. Paint, pigment, stain, or dye. We see no capillarity. We see no cementation. We see no directionality. And, of course, brushstrokes too. We see no light source. Some people tried to say, oh, maybe this was drawn, or like with Craig and Breesy with dust and using a paintbrush, and maybe this was done in the actual tomb, like maybe the shroud's authentic in the sense that it was a painting done of Christ. And I'm like, these people were in a hurry to get back home. you know uh they didn't have time to sit around and have an art project in the tomb. So I mean, sometimes these explanations start to get so absurd, it becomes a lot more reasonable and rational to think that the shroud was supernaturally created, because it ties into the context of the claims that Christ made, that he would be killed and then rise again on the third day. And we have this in the Gospels. We have evidence from secular sources, including the Jews, that were Jesus, I mean, the Jewish leadership that wanted Christ executed. They thought he was a sorcerer getting his supernatural powers. They didn't think he was a liar. They thought he was a sorcerer because they saw or heard about the miracles that he was creating. And so when you put the shroud into that context, where even the Jews in the Talmud, it mentions Jesus as a sorcerer. I mean, they themselves believed that. So we have a man with a 2,000-year, an almost 2,000-year-old reputation of being connected to the supernatural. And when you look at all of the aspects, and you got to look at the shroud evidence as a whole, as a body of evidence. And a lot of times you can do ad hoc, um, maybe there's a little problem with this piece of evidence and a little problem with this piece of evidence, but you're going to find problems, or theoretical problems with any piece of evidence. But when you've got too much evidence pointing
Teddy,
in
try
one
to try to wrap up in about a minute. Oh, try to wrap
direction,
up in about a minute.
that's when you tend to find that the evidence is pointing to truth. So anyway.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so just for the audience, so you don't think, oh, why is Dale being so rude was the host? I'm just trying to manage the time because Mark is only here for 2 hours. So I'm just trying to maximize the time. But obviously, Teddy and Hugh, if you guys want to stay afterwards, we'll continue the debate and stuff like that after that. But okay, so
but I've only got 2 more hours myself because I'm on stage in 2 hours and a bit.
Okay.
Giant in Jack and the Beanstalk.
So Hugh, you got 2 hours from now, or
supernatural magic beans.
That's the one. Guys. Yes.
All right. So Hugh, just so
are you the giant?
Yes.
Don't I look like you are? Okay.
Fee, fi, fo, fum.
I smell the blood of an Englishman and all of that. Yeah.
That's me.
Okay, so all right, so I guess we have to finish at the 2 hour mark precisely then. So like around 12:30 my time. So okay, so in that case, I want to kind of quickly go over all of the physical features. And I guess to start, I'm just gonna get a yes or no from each of the panelists. So okay, so in terms of body image uniformity, so the fact that the shroud images within about 2% differences are uniformly the same intensity of color. Does Garlaschelli's technique explain this? Yes or no? And Teddy, I'll start with you. Yes or no?
I don't think he's shown us any evidence of uniformity. And in fact, he talked about how difficult it was to,
Just yes or no.
yeah, no.
Okay. Mark, yes or no? Do you think Garlaschelli covers the body image uniformity?
In a word, no.
No. Okay. And Hugh, what's your take? Yes or no on that one?
We may have different definitions of uniformity, but I think yes.
Gotcha. Okay, so there's a difference there. Next up, in terms of the three-dimensionality of the body images and the vertical mapping, Hugh, I'll start with you. Yes or no on that?
Yes.
Okay. Mark?
You mean, has Garlaschelli got that?
Yeah. Can he replicate that?
No.
And Teddy?
Maybe because the whole thing with the three-dimensionality deals with cloth to body distance. So if you're putting the cloth on top of an actual body, you are probably going to have some degree of that with a bas relief. That's not the full dimensions of a body, and so I think that creates problems. But where I used a real body, I mean,
So maybe then for you.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Body image superficiality now. Mark, I'll start with you. Does Garlaschelli replicate that?
I couldn't tell from looking at it, and I didn't actually speak about that with him. So on that particular case, I would just have to say I don't know.
Okay. Teddy, yes or no on that?
No,
Superficiality?
there's
No.
just no way.
And Hugh?
He tried 2 experiments, of course, and I've got a feeling that his slurry experiments almost certainly not.
Gotcha. So it's
But his
yes
dry
and
powder experiments, of course, was yes.
gotcha. Okay. All right, cool. So we've already covered the blood stains. I think that's it. So yeah, so now I'll open it up to you guys to get into some of the details on these things because we disagree about all of them. So let's first have a discussion about uniformity for the next few minutes or so. Okay, so I'll start with you, Hugh. You answered yes. So why do you answer
Well,
yes? How does Shelley get this?
To my mind, I'm asking myself, what do we mean by uniformity? Now, I mean that doesn't specifically refer to anything at all, but I think what we're referring to is uniformity of color, by which I take it to mean what we might call monochromacity, the same color. Now, if I take this red pen here, it can only produce red ink, and the ink that it produces is all the same color. And a blob of red ink should be almost the same, however I do it. But as I do it here, you can see that, of course, there are darker bits and lighter bits. Now, is my color uniform or is it not uniform? Now, if you say that that is not uniform, then I will agree with you. I will say, okay, that's fine. But then the shroud is not uniform either. If, on the other hand, you say, yes, it's all the same color, but there's bits of white showing through, then I'll agree with you there. And I'll say, yes, in that case, that's this uniform, and that's the same as the shroud. So if someone will come up with a different definition of uniformity that I disagree with, then I'd be very happy to hear it.
So what about the definition of uniformity to add to it? The density, because for example, with watercolors, if you have some red watercolor paint and you paint it,
This is watercolor.
Pardon?
This is watercolor.
Okay. So it looked
I
like
have painted it.
Okay.
And the reason it's pink is because the layer of red pigment in this pen is spread out more thinly, whereas in the other areas, it's spread out more thickly. If I was to take, say, that little bit and put it under a microscope, we might see something like that. Whereas if I take that little bit and put it under a microscope, we might see something like that.
Right. And you're going to have differences in density because, for example, if on a piece of paper, because right now you're using a smooth whiteboard,
Oh,
it's
yes,
not
I am.
it's not grabbing onto the color very well. And so you're kind of that marker. It seems like it's got a felt tip on it.
It is, yeah, yeah.
So that it's kind of moving it around. But if you were to use a watercolor, like a brush and on paper,
Pen, yeah.
something
Sorry.
less slick, and you brush a layer of red paint on it, and then you let it dry, and then you apply some more red paint on
Yep.
half of it. The one half that has the 2 layers or 3 layers or 4 layers, it is going to look different, and it's not going to be uniform within, say 2%, within 2% or less if you've got these additional layers. Whereas with the shroud, we see that all of the colored fibers that make up the body image have within about 2% or less the same shade, the same hue, and that the darker spots aren't because they've been layered, but just because we're seeing numerous fibers close together to give that darker effect. But and we see that too, just like when Barry did the transmission photographs, we see the superficiality of the shroud, how you could see the blood stains, yet the image just disappeared because it was so superficial. And if it had been iron oxide, the iron oxide would have reflected the light. Whereas because there was nothing on the shroud creating the image, it absorbed it, and or it was transmitted. It goes through the fabric, and that's why you could barely see the body image. It was practically invisible when he did that transmitted light experiment.
Teddy,
And
I'm kind of curious. You remember Giulio Fonte sent a picture? Is that relevant to what you guys are discussing about the uniformity?
yeah, the picture. Well, no, that had to do with Garlaschelli when, in terms of trying to wash out all pigment. Julia was noticing in Garlaschelli's presentation that there were little bits and accumulations of blue dots from the cobalt blue pigment that was used. And meaning that nobody, especially on a 14 by 3.5 roughly, foot cloth, how is anybody going to wash something so well that it's going to remove all traces of any pigment used? That's a bigger miracle than the shroud being the result of the resurrection, the shroud's body image. So because at least the shroud's body image is in the context of as I mentioned before, Jesus, who has a over almost a 2,000-year-old reputation of being connected with the supernatural.
Sounds good. Yeah. Mark, anything you wanted to say from what you heard about the
Yeah, I
uniformity?
think when Teddy mentioned the transmitted light photographs, I think that is apart from one of the simplest, it's also one of the most important parts of the discussion about the whole body image. Basically, what it shows is that the image consists of nothing that was added to the cloth. That automatically discards painting, anything that's added to the cloth. And once again, talking directly to Hugh, even as a Shroud skeptic, I don't see that should cause any problem. Let's leave, just for the sake of argument, the supernatural part to one side, and the fact that the image is not a painting and never was. I don't see that doesn't prove anything about the Christian faith, the fact that the shroud image doesn't consist of any painting. So again, I don't see any problem for a skeptic to admit that particular aspect of shroud studies. And that is well proven by the transmitted light photographs. Such a simple experiment, and at the same time, such an important one.
One of the things,
thanks, Teddi, for mentioning that.
Sure. One of the things that I also wanted to ask or to add is that with the use of an acid, you're not going to be able to have some tight control over where the acid's going to go. Because if the acid is in a solid, it's not going to do anything, as Garlaschelli admits. If it's in a liquid, then you've got the capillary flow, where that acid is going to flow beyond the specific area that you want it, and then that's going to distinguish the body image that's being created with acid from what we see with the shroud, because the body image does not exhibit capillary flow. We would also see it with acid in the interstices of the cloth. If a liquid or a slurry with acid was used, then we are going to see meniscus marks on the sides of the thread. And that's going to be a problem in terms of showing superficiality, because that's not going to just be maintained on the top 1 to, I mean, Hiller and Adler, they were pretty much saying top 1 fiber. Some people say 1 to 3, but regardless, we got to remember, you've got threads, then you've got fibers, which you've got about 1 to 200 fibers in a thread, and it can range because these are hand spun threads. And so they're not all the same thickness. And then within each, so you got the thread, you got the fiber, and then within each fiber, you've got hundreds of microfibers, and it's just on that top 1 to 2 fibers. So how does acid in a liquid or semi-liquid slurried state maintain itself that superficially and that uniformly? As they're applying the acid, you're not going to tell me that there aren't going to be areas that get a double or triple or quadruple or more than that layer of
exactly. Yeah.
And
exactly right.
So some areas of the acid are going to have to go deeper, especially when you're dealing with a 14-foot cloth. Now, also, when we get into the bas relief, like with the body, if somebody's going to go there, which I know he's going to go there, you've got to account for the back image and the frontal image and the dorsal image corresponding with each other. So somebody would have to have created 2 body images, front and back, in a bas relief that correspond just right and which show evidence of rigor mortis and cadaveric spasm and all of these.
You just took the words out of my mouth, because I was going to ask this, so you brought it up. That's great. Another aspect of uniformity is uniform density of color. The maximum density of color, darknesses on the front and back, are the same, and that would not be expected with the flipping a body over as Garlaschelli does or something like that.
Sure. If you're using a bas relief, you'd have to have a separate bas relief, because a bas relief is not a statue. If it's a statue, well, then both sides are going to correspond, because it's a full 3-dimensional sculpture. But with a bas relief, plus a bas relief is necessarily far shallower. Now you have more shallow bas reliefs, and then you have some that are in a higher relief. But regardless, they're never going to usually, from what I've ever heard of, a bas relief is never going to have the full degree of form that like a human form would have. It's not going to be quite the same. So and then the dubbers, then to throw another thing in, what about with the facial image, what Giulio Fonti talks about, the double superficiality in some areas with the facial issue? Then it's like, how did that? I don't know. How do you get that?
All right. So Hugh, I want to kind of turn it to you. I've got a couple questions. So one is I wanted to ask, you can address the double superficiality. I myself don't include that as a fact, but still explain it for Teddy because some people do say it's a fact. But also the maximum uniform densities on the frontal and dorsal images, that those are uniform. And the other thing with superficiality, because I know that you dismiss the claim that, oh, it's only on the thread level, it's only the top 1 to 2, as Teddy said, or 2 to 3 fibers. Now, I looked into this, and in the peer-reviewed journal, it does say 3 to 4 fibers deep. So most areas, it's the 2 to 3, but there are some areas where it's 3 to 4 fibers deep. Do you agree with that from the peer-reviewed journal? Like, if someone were to say 3 to 4, would you agree that's a fact?
I would ask them how they know. How they know?
Because they were looking at threads.
How?
Julio has threads, and
if you look down on the thread, you can't tell how many threads deep a thing is.
Well, I don't know. I can't say in terms of what exactly they did, but I know
I've never seen anybody demonstrate the thickness of coloration through a thread.
Well, wait a minute. Heller and Adler used a probing needle, and so you can easily.
So they sort of poked out a couple of fibers and then thought that they were
sure. I mean, I could do that myself if I had a needle.
I mean, I've seen it. I've seen that with Giulio. I was with Giulio Fanti as well in his laboratory, and he showed me that under the microscope with his threads.
So he poked out a couple of fibers off the top and showed that they were
He's
clear.
got some. Okay, the provenance of these fibers scientifically is not verified, but they are from the Shroud.
Yeah.
I mean, again, if you're talking officialdom, then they would have to come with a certificate of the Vatican or whoever.
Yeah.
But they don't. But they are from the Shroud.
Yeah. So you've seen a couple. But the idea that somebody says it's 1 and somebody else says it's 2 and somebody else says it's 3 and somebody else says it's 4, I think that's trivial. No one's looked at enough of them to be able to say.
Adler did, and
no, they didn't poke around with enough fibers to find out. As it happens, I agree. I agree that the image is superficial to each thread, and I'll tell you why I agree that every image is superficial to each thread, and that is because I have soaked hundreds of threads in paint. Not 1 or 2, I haven't poked around with a little needle, I have soaked hundreds of threads in paint, and then I have looked at them sideways on, down transversely, and I can see whether the paint soaks in or not. And you'll be amazed to discover that it doesn't. You're absolutely right. The color probably does not go into the thread because color hardly ever does. That's all.
But there is no paint. I mean, that, No,
color. Don't forget the paint. Color. Color does not seep in.
Color, color has to have a way of attaching. It can attach either through a powder.
Only affects the top couple of threads, couple of fibers in each thread.
If it's a powder, first of all, you have the issue of how is the powder being applied. If I got a brush or a dauber and start applying powder, that's almost certainly going to it's going to have to agitate the cloth underneath. And then that's going to start seeping into the fibers. I mean, the only way you would, with powder, not do that is if you had confectioner's sugar and started sprinkling it onto linen and it just drops on there, then sure, it's not going to seep in.
You really ought to try it out one of these days.
I will have to.
I don't know if Dale keeping my PowerPoint presentation in reserve, because this is all on it. Have you? And you've been sent it. Have you looked at it at all?
Yes, sir. Me or Teddy?
I saw a little bit of it, but I didn't quite. I don't know that I was quite understanding.
It's fascinating.
Well,
every now and then, you really ought to check my sources.
Yeah, well, let's look at it.
Anyway, but the point is that I'm agreeing with you.
Okay.
The color does not go very far into the threads. But what I'm saying is that that is not amazing. The color of any kind of distortion does not go far into the threads. In 1973, the Italian Commission noticed that even the blood, which goes right the way through the cloth and comes out on the other side, doesn't soak into the threads.
Okay. So Hugh, I still want your questions about the uniformity of the density. And the other thing is with the 3D, I forget if it was Teddy or Mark who brought the 3D and vertical mapping. What?
Hold on. Wait. We gotta just address. With blood, for example, we know that when you draw, I mean, Barbet had talked about when you drop, and I've seen it, you drop a speck of blood, a drop of blood onto linen, it starts spreading across the linen. Okay, so that's through capillary flow. I mean, that's going through the thread, and it's not just.
It's going between the threads. It doesn't go through the threads. This is what was discovered by the 1973 Commission when they took out a blood-stained thread and it came apart in their hands, and they noticed that the middle fibers were completely untouched. It's also available to you if you find yourself with a lancet and a hanky. All you have to do is put blood on a hanky and then you wait till it dries, look at it.
Well, I've had a bunch of little things. Every time I have a little cut, I'm like, where's my linen?
Yeah, I bet you do, yeah.
I'll have to take a look, but I mean, and there could be differences in terms of, but I dispute the idea that it's just going into the interstices of the cloth and just out. But I mean, you've got with linen, you've got the lumen, and so it's not going to go in that. It's going to go around it. But
No, you're mistaking the lumen of the fiber with the thread. The thread has no lumen. The thread is a bunch of twisted fibers. The blood doesn't go into the fiber at all, but it doesn't even go into the thread more than 2 or 3 fibers.
But all of that is from flax, so it necessarily has a lumen, right?
No. We're getting a bit biologically unsound here. Here is a thread, and it's made of fibers.
Right.
Yeah. Now, each fiber has a lumen. These are the tubes running through the middle.
But the microfiber does not have the lumen. Is that what you're saying?
Fiber. Yeah. So,
okay.
No, that's all I'm saying. Now, if we pour some blood over the top of it, it goes over here, it goes over here, it goes round here, and it comes out the side. It may dribble into the first 2 or 3 bits, and then it dribbles out, and it looks like that. So this fiber has got blood on it, and so has this fiber and this fiber and this fiber, and for all I know, maybe this one and this one. But these have no blood on them. And then we got to the bottom of the cloth where all the blood ends up, and that's where it is there.
Well, do you think, is that due to the primary cell wall?
No, this is because the fibers are tightly twisted together.
And what does that prove? What's okay? Suppose we accept that.
What was I trying?
What I mean is,
there is some kind of idea that because the image is only superficial to a few fibers per thread, that means it must be miraculous or authentic. Whereas it is true of almost any painting that you'll ever come up.
I would agree with that. I've never said in my whole life that the fact that the image is 1 or 2 fibers thick, or the image, no matter how it was made, I've never claimed that means it's miraculous. I would, I've always tried to limit these discussions to science and history if we're talking about history. So yeah, okay. If what you're saying, Hugh, is that is proof that the image is not miraculous, then I'd go along with you
No, I'm
on
not
that.
saying I don't use the word proof myself. I don't say that proves anything. What I'm saying is that to announce that the superficiality of the image is somehow mysterious or evidence of authenticity or anything like that is
I've
not.
never said that. I've never
I didn't
thought
say
that.
you had. I didn't say you had. But funnily enough, there are
Okay,
people.
no. I'm not. No, I
commentators who have said
understand that.
exactly.
I'm just making it clear. That's all.
No, you're quite right.
So I just want to, Hugh, just one last, oh, okay, one last question kind of thing, because we're almost running out of time for Hugh's theory. We haven't even gotten to Hugh's theory yet, right? So,
I'll go through
Hugh,
it quickly.
great, you're explaining what you think. Now, do we actually have micro photographs proving what you're saying here, that that there are other paintings where it's just the top 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 fibers that are colored? Like, do we actually have proof in the same way we have with the shroud for that?
To be perfectly honest, I haven't looked to see if there are things of the Mona Lisa or anything like that. But yes, I should imagine so.
But we do know that with there's a difference in what we see with the blood image, with the blood stains
Yes.
that exhibit some capillarity, not as much because they're transfers of blood clots as opposed to liquid blood. But there is a noticeable physical difference with what can be seen with the blood stains versus the body image.
Yeah, certainly. The blood stains are very visible on the back of the shroud, whereas the body image isn't at all. It's entirely on the surface of the shroud.
Right. And so
whatever mechanism produced the image was different from the mechanism which produced the blood. I agree with that.
But if you're going to use paint, it's going to have more of the effect of what happens with the blood stains as opposed to what is seen with the body image.
Is it? Yeah.
All right.
Let's have
All
a
right.
look.
So I want to, Hugh, one last question very quick, and then I want to transition to your theory. But okay, with the three-dimensionality, I think you guys went back and forth very briefly on it, but there are, based on scientific experiments, various scientists have said there are just inherent problems with the bas relief. You'll get some three-dimensional properties, but you won't get the fine gradation of detail that you see with the shroud. And you alluded to Heimberger's paper where he says all you get are these vertical cliffs and flat plateaus. But here's the thing I wanted to say. Even Garlaschelli himself admitted his technique can't reproduce the full three-dimensionality and vertical mapping of the shroud images. So why is Garlaschelli himself disagreeing with you and saying, actually, no, my method can't reproduce the shroud's features here?
I'm not at all sure. I haven't seen a picture of Garlaschelli's bas relief. I've tried to have a look at it. I don't know what it looked like. But the normal way of cutting a wood block rather later on in the Middle Ages would be that if you looked at it transversely, the wood block would look something like that. In other words, it has gouges taken out of it. This is a piece of wood seen transversely, so that when you put some ink on it, or whatever it is, it only rests on those bits there, so that there's no particular reason why, for example, this area here should be thicker or denser than this area here. So the areas of color all appear to be much the same. And this would apply whether you put the ink on first and then lay the cloth over the top, or put the cloth on first. I haven't got another color. Put the cloth on first and then dabbed it with a sponge, which I think is what Garlaschelli did, and did it like that. However, as you'll have seen from my bas relief, instead of using the woodblock technique, which was just sort of coming in at the time, if the original wood was more shaped like this, then the cloth over the top would show all sorts of graduations. Whoops, where's my thing gone? Would show all sorts of graduations, whoops, as you pressed down on it, because the areas that you pressed on here would take more ink off the dabber that you dabbed down with, more than the area that you pressed on here. A bit more here, less here, and so on.
What about the
that's
overlap?
how I think it's done. Huh?
What about the undoubted overlap that's going to happen where some areas get much heavier, especially with the dauber as opposed to a fine, sable brush, doing detailed work. I mean, I've done work with watercolors. And for example, I had one piece that was a very large piece of paper. And as I was trying to create a uniform background in one color, oh, it looked terrible in terms of uniformity because there were just areas of overlap that are just unavoidable. And so if you're doing a whole frontal and dorsal life-size body, how do you get it to where there's no overlap and additional concentration?
Well, you don't, of course. I really recommend that people have a look at the alleged three-dimensional perfection of the shroud image, because of course it isn't. You look at it from a distance and you think, oh yes, that's amazing. But look at it close up, and you'll immediately see that it's for a start, it's nothing like a picture of a human body in 3 dimensions. Try looking at it sideways. But for a second, it's not even a very good bas relief. It's all wrinkled and battered here and there, where the density of image varies even in places where it shouldn't. If you look at the brow, for example, of the man in the shroud, you'll find that he looks as though he's made of a crinkled piece of paper. It's wholly unrealistic.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, but I think that the biggest thing with the VP8 image analyzer, what was so special about that is that regular photographs were not, an albedo image is not going to give you of like a person is not going to give you what a photograph of the shroud gives you. And so that's a unique and maybe
that's a giant red herring.
Maybe unique is not the right word, but
yeah.
it's a highly
the shroud's not a photograph, and it's not a VP8 image analysis of a photograph, especially one of 2 little children in color looking sideways. Of course, it's not going to have any relationship. That's I don't know why people put that forward.
But Jackson and who else? Erkeline. They tested also with the VP8. They had like a police sketch artist looking at the shroud, copying it. When they put it under the VP8, it was a disaster. They photographed a sculpture or a statue. That was a disaster.
No, it wasn't. No. The sculpture that they saw, did they immerse it in milk or something like that?
Okay, that's the separate.
That was extremely good.
When they first took the photograph of a sculpture, a statue, that was a disaster. It was only when they artificially created differences between light and dark by because first of all, they put some sort of phosphorescent liquid on the sculpture, and that didn't work with the photograph. But once they dipped that into that black ink, the light and dark as it was reflecting in the pool of dark ink and all of that, when they took a photo of that then gave them yes, a right on the money good VP8 analysis. But but who's doing that? Nobody's doing. I mean, this is
No. But the
earth
effect of what they were doing,
right, right.
The effect that what they were doing is that they had to look at a face. They had to look at it full face onwards, not sideways, not in profile. And they had to make sure that the lighting was uniform so that there were no shadows. And when they did that, then they found that they made an image which was not dissimilar from the shroud itself.
But are you talking about
they were demonstrating that, of course, a photograph of two little children in color will produce a rubbish image. That's not how it works.
Wait, I'm not understanding you, Hugh. Can I get some clarification? Are you saying that when they took a photo face on that worked with the VPA, or are you talking about the sculpture with the blacking?
They never actually got round to taking photos with the face on. If they had done, as you'll see that I've done, can't remember that I put it, it must be on the medieval shroud somewhere, of photos of, for example, a plaster bust, which is all one color, so it's not it's not changing its texture according to the color, the reflected color of the object. So if I take a picture of you now, your nostrils, your eyes, and your lips are going to come out dark, and so they're going to disappear into the thing. Whereas if your nostrils, eyes, and lips were all the same color because you were carved out of marble, then we get quite a good 3D image.
And you know the interest.
Okay, Teddy, finish this thought, but we have to get to Hugh's thing, so I want to make sure we have enough time for Mark to respond to Hugh's.
I've got about an hour and a half. Yeah.
I was just going to say
I've got about 2 or 3 minutes.
Oh,
2 or 3 minutes.
Well, here, Mark, go ahead. Mark, go ahead.
No, I mean, I was actually just enjoying the discussion that you're having. I get the impression that the three-dimensionality, the three-dimensional properties of the shroud is a very uncomfortable part of anybody trying to reproduce the image, basically because they can't do it. So it's something that people like Garlaschelli and others who have claimed that they've reproduced it, they either have to ignore it or try and say that it's not actually true. And it's just one of those points where, you know, sometimes I get the impression that, you know, we're banging our heads against a brick wall, trying to get people to say, if you are going to reproduce a shroud image, it's got to include everything. You know, 9.5 out of 10 is not good enough. It's got to be 10 out of 10. And if it isn't, then you haven't reproduced the shroud. And I don't think anybody has.
No, Mark. So first of all,
I've never met anyone, seen any image that reproduces all of the properties on the shroud.
I'd agree with you.
So Mark, yeah, first of all, I just want to apologize. I thought I had till 12:30 with you, so my apologies on not managing the time there. But just before you go, I don't know if you've had a chance to see Hugh's slides. I sent you the link to Hugh's slides.
Yes, I saw them. I saw them very quickly, but I was waiting till Hugh was going to run us through them and explain it, which I'll obviously have to do when I watch the podcast later on.
Fair enough then. All right,
and then if there's anything, you know, if we ever come back to this and you invite me back to the program, then I'll very happily discuss it. But it is something that I will watch, Hugh, with great interest once this goes online, because I have to leave now.
Right, thank you. But do watch it, and I look forward to your comments, but negative or positive.
Yeah, you're welcome. But we can do a round 2, Mark versus Hugh on his theory, and I'll just let you guys go if you want to. So yeah, just let me know, and I'll set that up.
Okay. Sorry, I have to leave. It's been a pleasure talking to you again, and I hope to be back on another program sometime.
Great talking with you, Mark.
Thanks,
Great
Mark.
talking to you, Teddy, too.
All right. So with that said, so Hugh versus Teddy, mano a mano. So so Hugh, I want to turn it over to you. Obviously, this is your hypothesis. This is how you think the images were made. And it's similar to Garlaschelli's in a lot of ways, but there are important differences as well. So I want to turn it to you to give your presentation. What the heck is your method? And yeah, what do you want to present about it? You're trying to share your screen.
Okay, I'm going to. If I can find where it is, I probably have to open something first. Hang on then.
I thought I was doing so well with the time too. Like I thought I had till 12:30 because we started late, but yeah.
Oh, well, I don't know, Mark's in Spain or something. Let me pop this up and then share the screen. Right, that seems to have got to there. Oh, I've got so many things to share. Screens. Yes, I think we'll share that. Ha, that sounds a good start.
Yep, medieval shroud.
That looks good, doesn't it? Go to slideshow and
there you go.
From current shroud. Right, there you go. I'm afraid it's got us in the corner. It's got me in the corner. But now, again, like Garlaschelli and like lots of other people, it's impossible to say that I've proved one thing or another. Of course, we haven't proved it. We don't know if the shroud is how it's in the situation, but the position that it is now is the same as it was when it was first made. We don't really know why it was first made. I think I've demonstrated that it wasn't made as a deliberate relic. It's, as numerous commentators have said, it's the wrong shape, it's the wrong size, it's got pictures on it, and everybody in the Middle Ages who declared that it must be a fake, their main reason for declaring it must be a fake was that because it wasn't like anything that was described in the Gospels. And if you wanted to make something that was a fake, then you'd try and make it look like something that was in the Gospels. However, as we can see here, we've got a couple of holy ladies heading towards some angels holding a gigantic piece of cloth. And this gigantic piece of cloth is part of the Quem Quaeritis ceremony, of course, and it was used in the ceremony to wrap up a body which was placed in the Easter sepulchre. This sort of thing would happen in thousands of churches all over France. And in particular, it seems to me that especially the emphasis on the humanity of Christ and specifically the suffering of Christ is a particularly Cistercian thing. So I looked around to see what the number of Cistercian monasteries there were in the area around Liry and Troyes. And I was astonished to discover that Cistercian monasteries are there in abundance. I did hear somebody, bless them, saying, "Oh, I can't think of any monastery that might have had an altar that was 4 meters long." And I just think how incredibly naive. I don't know if you've ever been to any large cathedrals in Europe, but they all have huge altars, which would be just right for holding out a large cloth that you might achieve if you had been to or attended a Quem Quaeritis ceremony. Just a quick review of the images that we find in the Middle Ages of the three ladies arriving at the tomb. In fact, just about the only scenes of the resurrection that we get, because it's quite a long time before the resurrection actually appears as an image in itself. As you can see up in the top left-hand corner, we have the Holy Sepulchre as it is now, photographed today, but it's not very dissimilar from how it was 1,000 years ago. And sure enough, the earliest pictures we have of the three women arriving at the tomb make it look remarkably similar. You see the round cupola on top and the square burial chamber underneath. And then as we move on, we find the angels talking to the three women, and eventually pointing eventually to the shroud, which was used in the ceremony, and then the ladies would take it. Well, actually, there were monks dressed as women would take it to the high altar and show it to all the people, and that's what it says in Latin in the middle. I don't know whether I need to read it out. I'm sure you can come to it. What are you looking for in the sepulchre, you Christ people? The crucified Jesus of Nazareth, oh heavenly person. And he goes, "It's not here." This is the black are the words of the little play. Ite nunciate, go announce who he has resurrected from the sepulchre. And then in red we have the rubrics, and somewhere along here we can see sed tantum lineae menea posita quibus crux involuta est. There's nothing there except the linen sheet in which the cross was wrapped. And seeing this, they deponent their turibula, they put down their thuribles and incense burners and things like that, and they go back to the main church, and they sumantque linteum and extendant contra clerum ac velute ostendis. They take it out and they show it to all the people, and they sing that the Lord has risen from the sepulchre. And after that, they superponentque the linteum altari, they put the sheet on the altar. And this seems to me what the shroud was probably originally intended for. Recently, I came across, I mean, you've got me in the way there. I don't know that I can move myself out of the way. If I go like, oh, look at that. Have I moved myself out of the way? So we've got all sorts of medieval inks here. So I've got a thing from Gloucester Cathedral Library, and there are, I think, 60 different recipes for making different kinds of stain to stain things with. And I've got the left and the right. I mean, I'll publish these in a blog sooner or later so people can look at them more closely. But we can see to make red water, you take good Brazil wood, and we're mixing it all up with lime, funnily enough, slaked lime, and that makes it nice and firm. Here's another one from the British National Archives. How to make hink. Take a gall and copperas. Copperas was iron sulfate, of which there was apparently more about than we have nowadays, perhaps. And gum of each a quarter or half a quarter. Break the gall into 2 or 3. So we're looking at oak galls here, and oak galls might be an important part of this after all. Just recently, I've been looking closer into Joe Assetter's idea that the ink used for making the shroud was oak gall. And the instructions for making that. And of course, more famously, and this is only a page from it, it doesn't have the instructions for making ink. We've got the famous Libro dell'Arte, which contains numerous instructions for how to paint or how to put an image. The painting is very, very minor. How to get an image onto cloth so that it doesn't flake off when you flap it about. Especially useful for things like flags and so on. Now, when we get on to whether the shroud could be a mold, a print of any kind, or a bas relief, or a dabbing, or something like that, I think we do well to look at this, which is from only shortly after the shroud was first displayed, and it is extraordinarily complex, a piece of woodblock print, and shows the sophistication that people were capable of at that time. These were not primitive people messing around with slabs of wood. Now, the construction of this is nothing like the shroud at all. It's not a bas relief, but you can see we've got the black panels were different panels from the red panels, and so on. But in my opinion, the shroud was made by wrapping it over something a bit like this, which is not, you'll see, a fully rounded bodily sculpture of the crucified Christ. His nose is not a lot higher than his cheeks, for example. So then obviously this isn't the model for the shroud, but I believe it was something somewhat similar to it. This is the image in Weinhausen, probably in Weinhausen Museum now, but it used to be in Weinhausen Monastery, and it's an image from an Easter sepulchre. And I think that something like this was made with both front and back, as you suggested, so that the elbows coincided in both cases, but it was only perhaps 6 inches thick. It wasn't your full bodily shape of the kind that you might find on a crucifix, which would be a full body shape usually. Now, you might say, well, why? How did they do this? And there are various accounts of what happened on Good Friday, which are awfully clever. Sometimes, especially in Spain, the crucifix had hinges in its arms, and Christ was taken down from the cross on Good Friday, and pins in the arms were taken out, and the arms were folded down across the front of the shroud, across the front of the body, I should say, and then this body was then placed in the Easter sepulchre. In other times, the crucifix was taken down and hidden behind the high altar, and a substitute body with the arms already carved in place was brought out, and they wrapped the body in that. Now, I don't think that the person who made the shroud did it as part of that ceremony, but I think that it was certainly inspired by that ceremony in order to produce a shroud that might have ended up looking like the sort of thing that might have been left behind by the dead body of Jesus after he resurrected. And I think that's quite important as well. The shroud was not intended to look as if it was a miracle. The medieval people knew what a miracle was. It was spectacular. There were no mingy miracles. A shroud with a muddy stain on it wouldn't be a very good miracle as far as the public, the congregation of a church. If Christ had produced his face as a miracle, it would have looked like a miracle. It would have been a full 3-dimensional color painting, like on the image of Edessa or something like that. Possibly with jewels on it as well. They weren't fussy, the medievalists. They thought that if God did a miracle, he did a really good one. So the shroud was designed not to look like a miracle. And the reason for that was that a miraculous shroud would detract from the actual miracle, which was, of course, the miracle of the resurrection itself. And I think we tend to get this a bit confused. In modern times, we think, wouldn't it be lovely if the risen Jesus left behind a miraculous kind of photograph of what he'd just done? That wouldn't have meant anything to medieval guys. They didn't have this idea of a photographic record of what had happened. There were vanishingly few records, even photographs, or not photographs at all, but even pictures of things. People didn't do this idea that we've got to take a picture of it so that we can keep a memory of it alive. You didn't come back to take a picture to make a painting of something until much longer after it had happened. Anyway, beside the point. So here's just a couple. This is the earliest surviving woodblock print that we've got, and you can see that it's like the one that I drew on the whiteboard earlier. The raised bits are all carefully carved, and they're all completely at the same level. They're fairly flat, so that if you cover them with ink and you stick a piece of cloth on them, you get the image in the middle there, which is the earliest block that we've got. And we can see that printing, or experimenting with printing, was coming in at about this time. Now, on the right-hand side is something that will truly baffle you all, because it doesn't look a lot like the face of the dead Jesus. And that's because I can't get, I haven't been able to find a a bas relief of Jesus, but I have found a bas relief of a bowl of fruit. And that's the best I can do for the time being. It's about life size. That's as you're seeing it on your screen. It's perhaps an inch or so bigger in each direction. And so I put a piece of cloth over it, and then, and this is where life gets interesting, I start dabbing. Now, the thing that I dab with, hold steady, it's only just there. I've just mixed it. Here it is. Oops. Or in medieval terms, we might call it a pouncer. I shall hold it up for you. Can you see? It's all fluffy at one end. It's held down with sticky tape, and I bounce it up and down like that. So first I had to dip it. Now, following actually, I think it was probably Teddy's advice in the first place. I've already done a thing on the visibility of red ochre. So I was looking at the visibility of yellow ochre. So this is mineral yellow ochre. It's from an ochre mine. It's not made out of iron oxide in a factory. It's from some French company. And I've mixed it it's an egg tempera. I've mixed it with water, with egg, and with a bit of vinegar. The point about the vinegar, it has 2 points. Firstly, of course, the vinegar slightly damages the cellulose underneath, but more usefully from the medieval point of view, the vinegar stops the egg from going off. Otherwise, when you come back to your tempera 2 days later, it stinks. It still works, but it's pretty revolting. But the vinegar somehow keeps it fresh. So by dabbing up and down on it, I can produce that image there. And then I turn it upside down, and that is the back of it. In terms of superficiality, it doesn't come through. Now, as we'll discover, in fact, quite difficult to make paint come through, but there we go. That says, that thing underneath says superficiality 1 from a textile level. So I think that compares quite well with the image on the shroud, which also doesn't come through, although we might see that there's little bits and pieces of the blood, certainly, but otherwise, especially if we enhance it enormously like Giulio, little bits and pieces do come through. Now, how about this? So I took a piece of this stuff and I absolutely soaked it. I didn't want it to, I didn't want to cheat by only staining one side of it. So I pumped up and down on my thing like that. And then I got a paintbrush and I painted it so it was thoroughly soaked on both sides. That's a strip of my cloth. And then, as you see, I rolled it up and sealed it with sticky tape. And then I cut it in half. And then I cut a tiny slice out of the middle. And to my delight, I have to say, can you see that the paint, however hard I try, I cannot make it penetrate those fibers?
Well, but
yeah, the paint, the fibers are beautifully clear. Yep.
Well, it does look there like there are areas where there are much thicker areas of brown.
Yeah. Yes. Because if you look at from the outside, you can see that. I mean, from the top left-hand side, from the top right-hand side, I should say, we can see the threads which, by coincidence, are the the threads that are going around in circles, whereas the brown threads are the threads which are going vertically up and down. But if we look at the close-up of the brown threads, we can see that the reason they appear brown is an illusion of the light. We can see that they are, in fact, completely clear, and that the paint is only seeped into the outside layer of the fibers. And I'm perfectly happy for anybody else to have a go at that, and you'll find something much the same. Now, I have to say that this is the sort of thing that constitutes evidence and has never been tried. Now, I can quite imagine, because people don't want to chop up bits of the shroud, but it's never been tried by anything else. All right, this is the 3D version. And I only put it in, and I don't know whether you think this looks more 3D or not. I think the thing about a human face is that the difference between the positive and the negative is so very different. Whereas the difference between a bowl of fruit seen in brown on white compared to blue on black is not very different, but it certainly produces a negative image which is commensurate with what we see on the shroud. That's the shroud itself, just as a comparison of it, because the real thing is that we see the face, because we know what a face looks like in a great deal. Our minds tell us that that's a face better on the right than on the left.
Oh.
This is the 3D version, and I think we'll see here a similar sort of thing. Now, just have a look at the brow above the eyebrows of the man in the shroud, and we can see that it's not brow shaped at all. There's that splodge in the middle, which of course is caused by the red blood stain, but most of it's completely sunken in. It looks as though perhaps the image was originally made out of tin foil, but the brow bit has been completely flattened. It's not good. Now, similarly, if I look over on the side to my bowl of fruit, the apple seems to have a big dent at the top end of it, near where the stalk is, and that dent is not really there. It's only because that's a place where the ink was not applied quite so seriously as it was elsewhere. But apart from that, I think we can see that the leaves are fairly clearly delineated, and the bunch of grapes look quite round. There's a lot missed out, but then there's a lot missed out in the shroud as well. Now, this is an experiment deliberately made by putting too much pigment on. Now I'm going to go on to this. I don't want pigment. Pigment is not involved in my ultimate hypothesis, but we start with pigment. Now, I don't know if you've seen photographs of the sticky tape slides, but they all look like the ones in the middle. In other words, you would be hard put to say whether the sticky tape had been applied that way or sideways or at right angles or any way. It's done nothing except pick up random surface debris. Now, Max Frey-Sulzer's tapes, if you push down on the shroud, you pick up a very good image of it. Now, you don't have to do it in yellow like I've done it. You can do it with nothing, with a completely clear tape. But you still, if you rub it in quickly and rub it in hard and you pick it up, you get an image of the fiber, of the fabric. And we don't find that with the shroud tapes, which has rather depressed me in the sense that I don't feel that they were really indicative of the substrate that they were taken from at all. Nevertheless, here we go. This is some of the tapes that were taken, and these are the ones that Nitowski and Kolbeck got access to, and we can see that quite curiously, and again, this was another serious failing on, I mean, you have to attribute it to Ray Rogers, is that he didn't have enough control samples. He did went for a few, but some of them didn't actually take. And the number of pure image slides was vanishingly small. They were obsessed by blood, and they took lots and lots of images of blood, but very few pure tape, almost none of the backing tape. I think they took one, and almost none, yes, of the backing tape, backing cloth, and almost none of the cloth which had neither image nor blood nor burn nor anything. So here are some of the sticky tape, the Stirp sticky tape samples as photographed by Eugenia Nitowski and Joseph Kolbeck. And the first thing we notice is how completely covered in particles they are. They're completely covered in the background is completely covered in particles. Even the pieces of fiber, many of them, but not all, many of them are also covered in particles. The bottom one in particular we can see. And now this is, bear in mind, this is from image tape. It's not from blood tapes. There shouldn't be any blood particles here. Whatever is here are image. Now, as it happens, I don't think that there's enough particles left behind to be visible. But the idea that there is no pigment on the shroud is grossly misleading. Every slide is covered in dots of pigment of one kind or another. And as we're seeing through the bottom here, the pigment appears opaque, and therefore it's quite likely to be iron oxide of one kind or another. Now, this is quite fun because now we go to Giulio's tapes, and he has had this idea that the image, whatever it is, damaged the cell wall, but not the primary cell wall, but not the secondary cell wall. And up here on the top right-hand side, top left-hand side, where the number 2 is, I think is particularly brilliant. You can't predict this kind of thing. He must have just spent hours and hours and hours, like I have done myself, poring over these slides and suddenly come across it. And wow, look at that. And we can see that what appears to be here is that the primary cell wall has split and peeled slightly back, showing the rest of the fiber inside, and it appears to be clearer and more unmarked. And down at the bottom, there seems to be another one there where it's kind of sort of peeled apart, where you get that sort of Y shape, and one bit is peeled off the other. And there's a little bit more at the other two, looking a bit the same. Now, this is how I query anybody's idea of what they mean by uniformity. These are Mark Evans's, a single photo, which I've jiggled with in a number of ways, but I haven't added any extra bits of color to one side or another. The whole bit has been treated. If I've done a process to it, I've processed the whole thing. We can see that it's covered in particles. We can see that even, especially if you look at the bottom bit, the color of the image is different. The left-hand side is more yellowy, the right-hand side is more orangery. We can see that individual threads vary in color from place to place, and they vary in intensity from place to place. We can even see that the color appears to go right to the edge of the thread and perhaps disappear off down the sides. And if we look at Giulio Fanti's interpretation of a similar slide, this one from the foot, whereas that one was from the nose, and we can see here that he spots what he calls abrupt terminations of color. The fiber is a color and then it stops being a color. What's more, and I think black is really important, here we can see where the color goes deeply into the cracks between the threads, especially right in the middle of the top left-hand picture. The image color there goes deeply inside that little crack. We can see it folding over and disappearing inside. This is not a purely surface phenomenon. And then he mentions continuity of color across threads, which we can see in the green thing, and patches where there is image fiber and non-image fiber, even on the same thread. Oh, this is my version of it after I've washed all the paint off. You can see I'm looking at threads here, and you can see a few particles here and there, but almost all the particles have been washed off. As I say, they then had to be ironed. Now, after we'd ironed them, what have we got left? We've got fibers in which nearly all the paint has disappeared, or we can find fibers where the paint has disappeared, and yet the fibers are of different colors. I've got here just an example of a slightly yellower fiber next to a slightly whiter fiber. And I attribute this to the destructive action, possibly, of the vinegar. Well, that's what I'm hoping it is anyway. Otherwise, I don't really know. Perhaps the fibers turn up with different colors anyway. here is my version of Giulio's idea that the surface area, that the primary cell wall is affected, but not the interior of the fiber. If you look at the sort of upper middle of the left-hand picture, you can see a kind of fist shape punching through a sleeve of discoloration. And if you look at the right-hand picture, you can see what looks like a little sort of ball pushing its way out through a discolored sleeve. So I've raced through that quite fast. And rather than saying this is how things must have been, what I've done is I've really just shown you a lot of evidence.
And these are photos you've taken of your samples. Where this damage is done.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So, Teddi, I want to turn to you to give you your uninterrupted kind of opening take. You've heard this presentation from Hugh as to what his method is and some of his results and stuff. So, what do you make of Hugh's process in general? Yeah.
If you want me to flip back to anything, then just.
Well, it would have been easier had I been able to just jump in as you were presenting, but I didn't want to interrupt your presentation because it's hard to remember all the points.
Well, yeah.
But for example, like one of the things that struck me, you were talking about the brow on the VP8 on the Holy Face. There you go. So you're talking about how it looks sunken in, but to me it looks raised. Because the lighter portions are the raised portions, right? And the darker portions are what are sunken in. So it looks like those caterpillar-shaped things are the raised brows, right?
We seem to have the sort of a transverse ridge across the eyes. Apart from that, I think it's all buckled in.
I mean, this thing here, right? It's like that.
Yeah. But what about this bit here?
Well, there's
an enormous great dent underneath. Below the eyebrows, it just collapses in until it's the same height as the eye sockets.
Well, but a lot of men especially tend to have a bit of a raised area in the forehead, right?
Yeah, but it's not even a dent. It just looks like it's going back in. Like you admitted this. You can't see my mouse, but the upper brow, that's from the distortion of the blood stain. So that's why that bit's a little bit raised.
Bit here is the blood stain. But this area here.
But that's where it sucks in from the hair of the brow back to the skin.
This area, the whole thing looks as though it's been smashed with a hammer.
The other thing too is I would assume
it should be smooth like the nose here. It should be all bright white.
I don't know about that, because think about blood accumulating on the brows and then drying and then building up, a blood buildup from the crown of thorns. That would create.
If you think that looks like the brow of a human being, then good for you. But it doesn't. Not to me, it doesn't.
I mean, you're just saying where it's raised, where the white is. You don't think that looks like a brow, and then it sinks back in?
No, I think this looks like a completely caved-in area.
Yeah, I mean, and plus the brow bone protrudes. So aside from the hair on the brow and aside from blood accumulating on the hair of the brow, a brow bone normally protrudes.
This should be round and smooth. I mean, look at my brow. It's dome shaped. There's nothing dome shaped about this. I don't look as if I've been hit by a hammer just here. And this one does. But I mean, different people interpret these things in different ways, but that's my interpretation.
Your problem, Hugh, it's the hairline, basically. You think that's like a vertical cliff. It's like sunken in, and the hair is kind of sticking out. That's how you're seeing it, correct? Mm-hmm. No, is that correct? Right? Like, I wish.
But the hairline sticks out, obviously.
Well, obviously to you, I can see what you're talking about now that you're saying, but it's not obvious. I didn't see it that way. But the challenge I wanted to give to you is, great, you're making this point with the VPA, which we know distortions come up due to various reasons, such as maybe what Teddy was saying with crown of thorns and blood and stuff like that.
Well, and you know what?
What
I
about
was just
subsequent? Oh, here's my question, Teddy. Sorry, but subsequent. Look, we're not reliant on 1976 technology. There are other technologies that, and they don't show this cave in the forehead when
Yes, they
they're
do.
increasing the three dimensionality.
Yes, they do.
You know, I
Everyone.
have the answer, I think. Look at just the linen cloth, how much it gets raised from the cloth. So that tells us a lot.
Hardly at all.
Well, I mean, look at all of the texture going on just in the background of the cloth of the non-image area. We see how
Yeah.
much raised. So yet when you look at the cloth, you don't see some giant increase in, where it's protruding. So that tells us that what looks to be protruding isn't necessarily protruding as much as we might think, because we're comparing the background and we're seeing from just the weave what significant texture. So, I mean, it's creating quite an exaggeration. But I mean, I think that the key point about the VP8 is just that the it gives us an undistorted
You don't think that looks at all distorted? You think that looks exactly like a three-dimensional statue
not
person lying down?
exactly, but that's not what this technology, I mean, this technology, the VP8 image analyzer, was used to transmit from space images of Earth. And so, that wasn't what it was designed for. Um,
Oh, no, no, no. Well, I know, I agree with
what
you.
we have
It's
to,
just
what
that
we have
I
to do
don't think that.
what we have to do is a comparison between other photographs of other images and whether they get distorted versus the shroud. And I mean, that's kind of the special attribute of the VP8, that with a photo of a body that's of the shroud image, you don't get these weird distortions that you do with photos of other people.
Well, no, and the reason is because it's not a photograph. What it is, it's a print of a bas relief, rather like my picture of my bowl of fruit shows.
But remember, the bas relief that was done with the VP8 by Jackson and I think Erkeline, that came out distorted. They did not.
Not with, well,
Yes.
but his was slightly different because he
How's
took a photograph instead of taking a print of it. He took a photograph of a bas relief, which meant that he had shadows and things like that. That's why it came out all wrong.
But they took a photograph of the shroud and put it under
Yeah.
the VP8. So why is that not apples to apples?
The shroud is a print. It doesn't have shadows on it. It's really important that the shroud is not a photograph.
But when they did the bas relief, isn't that a print? Like, okay, you have the bas relief and then you put pigment.
I think
That's a print.
did he take a print from his bas relief?
Well, otherwise,
I can't remember offhand exactly what he did.
Otherwise, what was he doing with the bas relief? He had to have been putting some sort of pigment on it and then putting that image underneath the.
Oh, they're printing it. Yeah.
So I would say that is a quote unquote print.
I'll have to go and check that out because
But I do remember
Teddy,
very specifically that that Heller in his book lists off, and I mention it in the paper that I just wrote. Hopefully it'll be published soon. But I get into some aspects of the VPA that I thought was very interesting. And I get into interesting aspects about the photonegative quality. A lot of times people tend to dismiss that aspect of things, but I mean,
Just before we get there, the three-dimensional, just can you kind of just summarize what was your answer to that? And to the
Mine,
three no, Teddy, what was your for the audience, just kind of summarize what was your response to Hugh's objection on that?
I'm not following his object. Well, I mean, I'm agreeing that if one uses a bas relief and is using cloth, you are creating a degree of cloth to body or wood, a wooden body carved. You're creating that distance. So I think that you can get a certain amount of that from a bas relief, but I don't think you're going to get the full amount because usually a bas relief tends to be rather shallow. Now there are some that have higher relief, but even the ones that have higher relief are usually not the same as a well done lifelike statue.
you mean like that?
Right. It looks a bit flattened, as you, I think, even agreed that the nose is
Yeah,
not is
looks like a bas relief.
right, right. And so it's not going to give you the quite the same degree of cloth to body distance. And I think you still have to deal with, because I mean, look at that bas relief. You still have sides that I would think would still cause too much wrapping distortion.
This particular one, you might have, yes, if you allowed the cloth to wrap around the sides. But then, like Garlaschelli did, he did with the whole human body, most of it, and just didn't bother with going down the sides. He just tapped away at the top.
But
And
he
it
was
seemed to,
having a devil of a time with the wrinkles, which that was something that
you know,
I've always wondered too. Like I still haven't figured that out, how the body image is free of any apparent wrinkles, and it starts making me think. I mean, this is just something I've
the,
been
flat,
thinking
the
about. I have
flatter the cloth, the fewer the wrinkles. I'd certainly agree with that.
the what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
The flatter the cloth, the fewer the wrinkles.
Right, right. But I mean, how do you get that image? How do you impress that image on a body and not have distortions from the wrinkling of the cloth? And I started positing the idea of, is there some sort of an electromagnetic field that comes about from energy from the resurrection to where the cloth became flat at the time of image formation? I don't know. I mean, I'm just
There. This was yeah, Isabel Pixek's idea that the cloth somehow sort of, well, the whole lot, the body, then both sides of the cloth all sort of rose in the air and ended up as three series of horizontal lines. And then you've got Dr.
boy.
Lavoie, who thought the whole thing was vertical and the cloth was vertical on either side of him. So, I mean,
I'm
there
not sure
are.
whether Jesus was vertical. I mean, maybe not, but I think there's something to it about the cloth um hovering over the body in a very flattened way, perhaps due to some sort of electromagnetic field, or I don't know that
Well, I'm sure Bob's nuclear thing will account for all of that.
could be. I mean, and that would account because I mean, if you think about it, and Garlaschelli talks about it too. And when I read that, I was like, that was always something that bothered me. It's like, how are there no wrinkles? And also just how are there no smudges in the blood? That's quite stunning to me. But anyway, with the grapes. that you brought up. I don't think that that has as much because it's all rounded. I don't know if that gives as much of the possibility of distortion through the VP8, like especially through vertical planes and things, uh, as the V as
I agree. It's not ideal.
Plus,
All
there's
I can.
no distorting things like blood flowing down it or stuff like that as well, right?
Yeah, well,
And I
quite. Yeah.
noticed on the 3D with the grapes, there seems to be like something poking out of them. Like, but I'm sure the grapes are
If
perfectly
you Ted,
round.
if you
Yeah,
see them on
yeah.
the side, if you Hugh showed me this on the side, they're like little pointed mountains. If you look at them on the side, he doesn't
You
have it
can
here,
see.
but like you see
Yeah,
how
so
it's,
that
like a
down
little,
here, this one's got a little nipple sticking out of it by the looks of
Right,
it.
right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So, I mean, what's up with
but
that? It looks like a distortion.
well, yes, it is a distortion.
Right.
So, but I mean, if I come across to here, are you suggesting that this is not distorted, that it's all absolutely
Well, I mean,
perfect?
it looks like raised areas due to a beard and a mustache and a nose, which are expected raised areas of a face, but a
It has.
great,
So what about this? We've got bumps and lines and goodness knows what all over the place.
yeah, I mean, but
I
it's
don't
also,
think.
you
I
know,
think that the variations are very much the same in both cases.
but for example, look at Jesus's the bridge of his nose. We don't see like things that look like big bumps popping up from it.
Um, well, we do. I analysed this picture that somebody did a really good version of it. It was Mark Rivera, was it, who completely removed all the marks of the cloth, leaving literally just image behind. And there we could look at it very closely and
But now,
discover lots of
is that
interesting things.
fair?
Ah.
Because I think that by looking at how the VP8 deals with the weave of the cloth, that gives us perspective as to how much distortion we can expect in general. If it's that sensitive to where it's picking up and doing what it does to the weave of the cloth, then I think that that's actually quite necessary as a control for
Yeah.
what we see on the image.
Well, I tried to make mine sort of similar and show a bit, similar sort of
And was
similar
that
sort
on
of thing.
linen? Was that on linen?
Yeah. And you can see the weave of the cloth, so it comes in little bits and pieces.
I was
It's
gonna
not as
say,
contrast is not as great, I have to say. I
um,
expect to do something with it.
it'd be interesting too, I think, for people because I mean, Deacon Peter Schumacher, I mean, the VP8, he's the VP8 specialist. I mean, we don't
Yeah.
have one better than he. I mean, he was involved with the company that was making them, and he's got one out there in New Mexico, and people can go and I'm sure if somebody
I,
even
I wouldn't use it myself because I mean it's so old-fashioned now that it doesn't it's not particularly useful.
but it's useful in the sense of doing an apples to apples comparison because quite frankly, I think it's not helpful when people use
Oh, yeah,
where
yeah, you
like
mean I should take my bas relief out to New Mexico and say, can you run this through the
or just mail it to
VPA?
them. Probably don't have
Yeah.
to fly from England to do it, but just mail it to him. And I bet you he'd be willing to do that. And because you got to remember the VP8 was analog, and so what was there is there. Whereas with Image J and all this modern digital software, I don't know that we can be sure how much stuff is getting filled in.
Well, yes. I mean, to say that the image J is analog is
It's not. I mean, it's
it's
digital.
nonsense. Not image J, but the VP8 I don't know what is meant by the word analog. And looking at something like image J, I'd like to know exactly what it is that the VPA does with the image. Now, it looks to me as if it creates shadows. It creates shadows. Would you say that's what it does?
It creates distinctions between light and dark, and actually,
but how does it do that? The image J has two different ways of converting intensity into height. One way is to literally make higher areas lighter than lower areas. And another way is to add shadows.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my podcasts has looked at that in fairly great detail. In fact, I might even share it with you because I think it might be worthwhile.
Here is what, who was it?
This is going to be alarming. I'm stopping sharing. Now I'm going to share something else.
Okay.
Right. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wonder if I can see any more of that. Good.
What is that?
Here are my things. So this was about trying to have a look at in particular, this is Mark Rivera's version. He took the shroud, which you can see, this is an image J thing on the left-hand side, and he removed all the distortions caused by blood and wrinkles so that the right-hand side is as close as he could possibly get to the image as it is. And we can sort of see that if I go to here, because if we take his version, this is the negative version of his version on this side, compared to the real thing on that side, and if we overlay the one over the other, we can see that he completely obliterates the image, which shows that his version is literally just image. So if we take his just image and start looking at it with a VP8, we can look at it in two different ways. So in this case, we've given all the high areas a lighter look from the darker, and the lower areas have a darker look.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were to give the image, now here, every single part of the image is the same color. And that's why it looks completely gray, because it's white on white or gray on gray.
Mm-hmm.
The only way we could detect this to see whether there was any kind of color. This is a bit like a whiteout in a snowstorm, or I don't suppose you get snow in Tennessee, do you? But anyway, well, if you've ever been in a blizzard, you can't tell where the sky or the ground is because everything is the same color. But as soon as you can get a shaft of light, we could start. Let me see if I can find it. Whoops! Start putting in the color into it. And I don't think I've done that. There. So that's where we start, given the intensity of each area, a slightly different color.
Mm-hmm.
We've had to give them a different color to make them work. Now that's a good way, but I don't think that's the way the VP8 worked, because there are no shadows on this at all. All there is light bits and dark bits. But once we start putting shadows onto it, the VP8 analyzer pictures seems to have artificial shadows added to it. And I don't know how much the artificial shadows can be added to it. This is just my version of how to make something look realistic or not. Now, how come we can see, especially this bust on the left-hand side, how come we can see it at all? Because it's all the same color.
Well, through the light.
There isn't any dark bits and light bits. The only reason we can see it is because of shadows.
Right.
And that, I think, is what the image analyzer does. But in this case,
it does. With the light and the dark, the raised portions become lighter and the recessed portions are darker, and that's where you get.
I don't know that they are.
That's my
I'd have-
understanding.
It's a density thing. So the darker, the tip of the nose is higher up because it's darker. It's the darkest area. So it reads the density of the thing, right? Darks and lights. The lighter it is, the more recessed it is. The darker it is, the more it sticks out.
Well, with the tip, wait a minute, I'm not confused. Isn't
stop
the tip of the
sharing
nose
again.
lighter? I think that
Go back
the highlights are always at the tip.
go back
The
to that.
tip of the nose is the darkest
Now,
of the whole shroud.
but I've got shadows down here. This is dark. And the reason it's dark is not because this bit here is lower than this bit here, but because there's a shadow on it. And similarly, this line here is not lower than this bit here. It's got a shadow on it. And similarly, we can see we've got the bright surface at the top of the nose, immediately followed by a massive great trough. Well, you know that's not a massive great trough. That's dark because of the shadow. So what the VP8 analyzer does is it adds a shadow.
But there are no
It doesn't necessarily, sorry?
But we don't really have shading.
We do. This has shading. This is completely made of shading. It's not made of anything else. The only reason we can see height here is because bits are shaded. Bits which are higher are leaving shadows on bits which are lower.
But I think that the shading comes from image versus not image, and then in some areas,
look at this little. You see, I'm making a ring around a little dark worm here.
Right,
Can you see my cursor? Now, is this bit here lower than all the rest of the image? For that matter, is this bit here lower than all the rest of the image? No, this bit is dark, not because it's low, but because it's in shadow.
Isn't that beyond the cloth where you're pointing?
Yeah. But I mean, it's still made by the analyzer.
Right.
And you see, we've got a light. The light is coming in from the top left-hand corner, and all the bits, say just here and here and here, all the bits which are away from the light are in shadow. They're not darker. They're not darker because they're lower. They're darker because they're in shadow. If we take, we might think of this as a little raised piece, and it looks raised because one side is a little bit lighter where the light is shining on it, and this bit here is a little bit darker where there is in shadow.
It'd be interesting to have Pete Schumacher.
I've only discovered this. Well, I say in the last 6 months. It would be interesting to talk to him and say, what exactly does his machine do?
Because my understanding is that it's a light and dark, and what is it? A higher point is going to be lighter in color, and what's at a lower point is going to be darker in color.
Yes. But that's not the case. The higher points are not particularly lighter than the lower points.
Well, I mean, but we're seeing the beard, the mustache, the coins over the eyes. I mean, it seems like those are coins, and they look
the bumps are. Let me show you. Oops. The bumps are because of shadows rather than because of lights and darks. Look, now this is, I'll make it a bit bigger so we can see it. This is the VP8 version. This has no shadows at all. Oops, oh no, help. My computer switched itself off. Oh, thank goodness for that. All right, there are no shadows on this at all. Lighter bits are colored light and darker bits are colored dark. Yeah?
Well, no, we also have to, okay, that's the negative.
Yeah, but this is higher bits are light, lower bits are dark. Now,
Well,
what I'm going
no,
to do
but
now,
they didn't use the photo negative, right? I don't think they used a picture of the photo
well,
negative.
the
Did they
machine
do both?
negativized it or
Did they
something.
do both? I
Uh,
don't know. I'm not sure.
I think
now,
they use photo
I'm going to
negative.
try and do this. I'm
I'm
going to try
sorry.
and do this live.
Okay.
Here, the higher bits are not lighter than the lower bits. So the whole thing appears to be a uniform blue. Now up here, there's a thing marked which says lighting. So I'm going to add a bit of shadow. And suddenly the shadow, and only the shadow, has made a sort of face sort of visible. And now, just like the VP8 image analyzer, this dark bit here is not lower than the background cloth. It's like that because it's in shadow. And if you compare that to the VP8 image analyzer in exactly the same area, this bit here, this dark bit here is not lower than the bit immediately to the right of it. It's only darker because it has had an artificial shadow added to it.
But now part of it is it's about the cloth to body distance, and the hair is going to be protruding, creating different.
Oh, yes, yes. No, I'm not saying that it doesn't do that. It produces it in its little mind. The hair has got a value of 26 and the background has got a value
That's
of
what
5.
the shroud image is
Yeah,
giving
but
it. Giving us
how
the
does
detail.
in order to turn those numbers into something you can see, how does the machine do it? And that's where I think it would be fascinating to talk to Pete Schumacher.
Because I think my understanding is the difference with the analog versus the digital is the analog, it's just it doesn't do anything fancy. It does what it does, and the operator can't tweak it or adjust it, and there's no AI manipulating the image, because that's
I don't
my
know if you no, of course the operator can tweak it and adjust it, and you can see pictures of John Jackson doing exactly that. You can make the gain bigger and smaller.
well, I mean, but there's a sweet spot where it's
Yeah,
like when
when
you're
it looks,
when you're adjusting a radio and
yeah,
you're turning the dial and you get a bunch of static. Well, yeah, you can move it around, but there's a correct spot, a sweet
it
spot
looks better. Yeah.
perception. And I think that's the same thing with the analog with the VP8, but with Image J, I wonder with these digital 3D softwares whether they do some filling in. For example, let's say you have an old photograph from, many
Yeah.
years ago, and it's damaged. You can, and nowadays, even just on a person's phone or on their laptop, you can have it to where it fills in stuff that is non-existent on the picture, because maybe the picture was torn and the artificial intelligence just fills it in perfectly. And it's brilliant. And I wonder how much of that is going on with stuff like ImageJ software, to where it is putting
None whatever. But
information.
it does have certain parameters, which, and I don't know whether the VP8 does it or not. And that is that in order to take the height, or to take the color of an area of the photograph that you're taking, you can look at the photograph and you can take the color of every individual pixel. Now, I don't know if this was an actual photograph of the shroud, then the actual pixels would be silver crystal, silver nitrate, silver iodide crystals, and they would be something of the order of a hundredth of a millimeter wide. And either they would be black or they would be white. And in that case, what we would see is a whole forest of pin needles.
Right.
Because the white ones would all be high and the black ones would all be low. And we
It
wouldn't
depends
detect
on how
anything.
sensitive. I don't think that the
Well,
VP
exactly.
quite
So
that
I think the VP8 image
Okay,
analyzer
guys,
is
I think we're getting
thinking,
bogged down bogged down with this stuff. It's getting a bit too technical, and we've
Oh,
been
yes. I've got about half an hour, and then I've got to run and be a giant.
okay. So if we only have half an hour, okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run down each of the features, and just get you guys to say yes or no on them. And then Teddy, for the next half an hour, I'll let you choose which things you want to go back and forth on, but try to cover multiple ones. And you guys haven't even talked about the chemistry of the paint, which I thought you would be wanting to talk about. But before I do that, though, let me just list out. So, photonegativity and the high resolution of the shroud. Teddy, do you think Hugh's method achieves that result? Yes or no?
I'm not sure. I'm going to reserve judgment on. I don't. I'm not sure. I have to look at it more
It's
carefully.
hard with just those circles to judge, right? Okay, Hugh, yes or no, the photonegativity and the high resolution nature of the images, and we can quantify
Yes.
that. Yeah,
I think my images are as good as the Shroud. I don't think
I
either of them are particularly good, but I think mine are just as good.
I'd like to know, but it would take studying it. But I suspect that if we really analyze what Hugh created, that it's more of just a contact transfer because that's what it was. Whereas the thing is with the shroud is that the image, while a good amount of the image was created through contact, there are areas and portions of the image that were not or wouldn't have been created through contact. And so that's where things start to get complicated. And
okay.
so the question is, does Hugh have a way of creating
Yes,
images without contact?
yes.
How do you do that?
Cloth is stretched over um, the profile, the bas relief.
Right?
So I spent a lot of time soaking the cloth and molding it down into all the cracks and things.
Right.
And when I did that, it meant that when I got my big stubby sort of thing over the top, it didn't reach the bottom, so I had no contact.
Right.
Now, what I've been doing recently is I've been stretching the cloth over the top. So now, when I jam down on my pouncer, when it hits this area here, I get a thick lot of paint. And when it hits this area here, because it's pushing it in a bit, I just get a thin lot of paint. And so I get the illusion that I'm collecting paint even from the bottom, but actually I'm not.
Okay, so
How that works.
all right, riddle me this, Batman.
I'm at your service, woman.
I guess. So, how do you create images such as the fine scratch marks that show up in ultraviolet light that are invisible in visible light? Can you do that?
I don't know. I have to say I haven't done any of this because I'm doing it all in the last week, and I haven't taken ultraviolet pictures of any of it.
Well, maybe if you eat some magic beans, that will help you.
So I have got an ultraviolet light. I'm not sure whether my camera's very good at taking pictures of it, but I'll have a go and see whether my vinegar glows ultraviolet and all that sort of thing.
But you've got to create stuff. I mean, for example, those scratch marks between the two, obviously marks from the plumbata from the scourge. Those scratch marks.
Yeah, so if I can make a few scratch marks, I'll have a go.
But it's got to
with a
be
wire brush.
but it's got to be invisible in visible light, yet visible in ultraviolet light.
Yeah, well, you can do that with almost any organic fluid, to be perfectly honest.
To
I could do
create
it with yeah, I could do it.
scratch
If you
marks?
try getting a stiff brush, I'm going to say not quite like a yard brush, but a bit thinner, smaller than that, and brushing a cloth with urine.
Mm-hmm.
Then take an ultraviolet picture of that. Absolutely fascinating. Urine is very, very fluorescent.
I take it
But,
you've
but it wasn't that they were, it wasn't that it was fluorescing, it was that we see scratch marks. I'm not talking about halos.
Yeah, but if you brush it with a stiff brush so that the bits aren't flushing together, then you'll get these stripes.
Yeah, but these were very fine. So how do you get that? And why
Use a thinner brush.
why would somebody have put that detail in the body image? Because again, we have to also take things out of the theoretical and put it into
when people were making the scourge marks, what did they actually do? Which managed to make the scourge marks were sometimes fluorescent in particular interesting ways. I don't know, but I dare say we'll get to that. This was about the.
I didn't hear the last part of what you said.
Well, this bit was about the image.
Right.
I can imagine if I had, as it were, almost a dry brush or something like that, I might make marks which didn't actually come out, or I didn't think they came out, but in fact the fluorescence came out, but not the pigment or something like that. I don't know.
All right. Well, I don't know. Dale, do you have any?
Teddy, so I'll just let you guys go because I'm not going to get to do my list thing. But Hugh, let me just ask you, for the sake of the audience right here and now, are there any of the properties of the shroud that Stirp has proven, and differentiate, if you don't accept them or accept them or whatever, but are there any of the main features of the shroud that your technique does not replicate? Like it cannot or has not replicated as of yet? And secondly, when you're replicating all these features, because I know you mentioned to me the reason you reject Garlaschelli's hypothesis is it's too complicated. It involves various things that can't be put together. So I'm wondering, is your technique suffering from the same thing? Can you get all the results on one cloth using one technique that accomplishes everything at once?
Yes, but of course I haven't yet, because what you have to say is, supposing I start with just some yellow ochre and an egg tempera. So what are the exact proportions of ochre, water? I thought of doing this, egg and vinegar. So I've got 4 constituents there. So I'm going to go, say, 5% vinegar, 5% egg, 80% water, and 10% pigment. That's probably a bit too thin. So I'm going to go to 70% water and 20% pigment. And the permutations of getting it exactly right would take me months, and I'm not going to bother. I think once I've got
capillarity with that mixture.
Yeah, we don't get any capillarity. Not when we dab things down on top. It's not visible.
So I'm still not quite clear.
Because I just want to get that answer clear for the audience. So just so I understand, Hugh, so you believe that you can get them all. You haven't so far produced that result where it gets everything: 3D, vertical, superficial, uniformity, everything, all those.
It certainly gets all those things, but it doesn't get them in the exact same way as the shroud does. So I think I'm on the right lines, but without getting the exact proportions of everything correct, it would be impossible.
And so what are those differences? Just lay that out, and then I will shut up and let Teddy go at you for the remainder of the show. But what are the differences? What are you not getting? What
do I still would like to be still working on? Well, I'd quite like them the padding down, damping down. I'm not quite sure whether I should be using a little tamper that's that big, or whether I should be using one that's softer but bigger. I think that would make a huge difference to the 3-dimensionality of the result. And so I really need a range. That's the sort of thing that I feel would make a big difference to what I do, and would therefore make people go, oh, that's much more like the Shroud, or that's much less like the Shroud.
Gotcha. So it's the
That
3D
sort of thing.
aspect.
Experimental detail. Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. So as promised, I will shut up. Teddy, over to you. We got to 1:30. You got 20 minutes before Hugh has to go.
So, okay, so you talk about this whole ironing, to iron the shroud after it's...
Yes, I felt, yes. Mind you, I did wash the Shroud in a washing machine rather than in a river. Perhaps if I'd washed it sort of and hung it over a cloth, it might have dried out more naturally. But I think it's going to end up wrinkled. And I think the natural thing for people to do would have been to put it on a table and run a flat iron over it.
So then you're going to have some degree of heat damage, and whether that's hot enough to create fluorescence from, I mean, it might not scorch if it's little enough.
Well, I mean, medieval people were no worse at ironing their clothes than modern people. So it wouldn't have scorched, but it may well have affected areas that were already slightly affected by the vinegar that had worked on them.
So I'm still unclear. What are you saying is, in your situation, with your experiment, what is creating the image? Is it pigment, or is it etching from the acid of the vinegar? What happens to the presence of the egg and cementation? I mean, how does, if you've got paint, how does that avoid getting into the interstices of the cloth and filling them up to where...
It doesn't. As you could see from Giulio Fanti's drawing, the image goes deep into the interstices of the cloth. Not his drawing, his illustrations from Mark Evans's picture. The image goes deep into the interstices of the cloth.
But it's not a well, he said something, I don't know the details of all of that, but he was saying where there appears, he thinks that towards the edges, sometimes there's a little bit of darkness, that is perfectly in line with a corona discharge and how that works. Now, I don't know how to fully defend that, because I just don't understand those sorts of things. Yeah, but that's why
Here we've got image going
right
deep down into the interstices of the cloth.
Now that's also the foot, which is very dirty.
And yeah, well, if I go back to here we've got some more of it going in there. Mine's a little bit fainter, but up here at the top here, it does the same thing. This is completely going down.
Like a shadow. That looks like a shadow from the thread.
This is on the nose. Yeah, but the color carries on down here. Obviously, that black bit is shadow.
Darkness is the shadow just between the two threads.
Yeah, the darkness is, but the image doesn't sort of stop dead just here. I mean, it would be a bit of a coincidence.
Sometimes the image carries on from one thread to another one, and sometimes it stops abruptly, which that's the other thing. Do you get those start and stop points with your what'd you call it?
Yeah, you get all sorts of stuff like that.
Would you call it a stomper?
This is more, I mean, this is more indicative of a pouncer. It's called pouncer.
Pouncer.
Yeah, it's medieval French for dust.
Pouncer.
Pounce. Yes.
So are you saying then that, so are you going basically with a more of a painting / powder? So are you saying that the image that you create is due to pigment, or is it acid etching?
I think that the when it was put on, it was due to pigment, but the pigment has now been removed. So it's the medium which is now producing that.
So
now
why
that
did
may be acid etching, or as I suggested right at the beginning of this conversation, I'm looking towards Joe Aceta now, and it may be tannin. It may be a stain, an organic stain from something like oak gall ink.
Well, oak gall ink, that's iron oxide. So, but we
Well,
don't have
it's also tannin from the oak. The iron
my
oxide would wash off, leaving just the color different. But I have to do a bit more of that. Yeah.
um and like if there was iron on there through the aging process on cellulose, that should create foxing. But foxing
No, I
and
don't. Foxing is by mold and bacteria. It's not a chemical process.
no, well, I actually it can be there. It's very controversial, but it seems like the best evidence is that some foxing is due to the presence of contaminants of metal, like iron in particular, because it was on, like with papers, with the printing process. But iron can lead to foxing. So if we've got a bunch of
But
iron,
not iron by itself. I mean, once it's done its thing, it can't react any more than it's already reacted. So, but as I say, I think most of the iron's washed off. So it's too trivial to be able to be seen.
yeah,
I don't know
but
if you my last blog post showed that using red oxide, there the visibility of the red oxide of the shroud works out very well, and looks very much as it might be suggested by the Morris London and
red
Shroud.
red ochre isn't
Yeah.
even the right color.
But with yellow ochre, you have to have a great deal more.
There is
And
no yellow ochre. Macron
sorry?
was saying red
he,
ochre.
he went for red. I don't know why. I think you were the one who suggested yellow, and so I went got
Yellow ochre is straw yellow. I've gotten yellow ochre and I've gotten red
yeah,
ochre.
yeah,
Yellow
me
ochre
too.
is good, but that's not what he says is on there. He
No,
said
well, it's to look at it through a microscope lit from underneath, it's almost exactly the same.
but you don't see, but the X-ray fluorescence did not pick up on the body image being created from any type of iron. The iron signal, it didn't.
I think there's not enough iron left.
But if the body image is visible, and with the X-ray fluorescence, it picked up on invisible iron from the retting process. So logically,
No. It picked up an invisible iron, but not from the retting process.
but it was
The idea that the shroud picked up iron from the retting process is a wild guess to account for the observation. It's not.
no, it's not a
It's not
wild.
evidenced by anything at all.
Well, that's not, I would disagree with that, because when Heller and Adler checked even modern day linen that's been retted, they found the iron, calcium, and strontium on that as well. And it's just an inherent part of,
Yeah, I've checked all their references. It's not there.
well, I mean,
I can't find it at all. I'm afraid they've misread their references. They had an awful lot to do, and they didn't get it right.
I seem to recall reading independent sources about that, and there are, I mean, that's why, they talk about trying to avoid heavily
Contaminated rivers, yes.
water.
I'm unable to find. I mean, I can quite see that it's probably not a good idea to dip your clear white or whitish flax into a stream that's running deep red with iron oxide.
But I mean, you're going to have iron in water in these natural bodies.
Yes, in some water, perhaps less in a calcium a chalk environment, than in an igneous environment, which might have iron oxide in it. I don't know, but there's no suggestion. The shroud was probably dew retted. How do we know that it was river retted at all?
I think dew retting came quite a bit later.
No.
I think that water
Dew retting is extremely early. We think that there are references in, is it Isaiah, to flax being laid out on the surface on the roof of somebody's house, presumably for dew retting?
I would think too that with dew retting, you're going to have differences in terms of chemicals. But the iron, but how do you then account for the calcium and strontium that is also? Where's that coming from? Dew retted.
Well, the place is thick with limestone. I mean, we could say it may be part of the manufacture of the cloth. We don't know what it is.
If it's dew retted, I would imagine it's probably put on top of crack.
If it's dew retted, it wouldn't have calcium or strontium in it. But
but we have a uniform layer of iron, calcium, and strontium all over the shroud that the X-ray fluorescence.
No, we have a uniform layer of calcium and strontium.
Iron too.
No, the iron is far from uniform. The difference that if you draw a line showing the amount of calcium from place to place on the shroud, it sort of wobbles around like this. If you do a place with strontium, it wobbles around like this. If you do the iron, it wobbles around like this. It's extremely irregular all over the shrouds.
That's not what they report.
Is it not? Well, try looking at their data. Do it yourself. The data is all published in their book. You've got a whole list of numbers.
I would think that scientists from Los Alamos and people like Heller and Adler aren't going to make claims, and those claims get approved in peer-reviewed journals like Nature. If their data that they're providing with that is contradictory to their claims, that would
seem back on that, Teddy, because this is something that I noticed with you a lot, Hugh, and it's come up multiple times. So I kind of want to ask this general probing objection or a little bit of a pushback, because with regard to superficiality, I mentioned the peer review talks about 3 to 4 fibrils, and most of the places it's 2 to 3 and stuff like that. And you said, oh well, yeah, how did they get that? As though they didn't do anything; they were just pulling these numbers out of their rumps. And now you're saying, oh yeah, well they've got the wrong conclusion and their own data disproves them. But how is this getting published in peer review? Like the
Nature,
level of,
and that's probably the toughest, especially
but Stirp never published anything in Nature.
Yes, they did. Well, I mean, the members of Stirp, Jumper, I think Pellicore also, didn't he? I believe Pellicore.
Not based on Stirp results. But my question is like the
Applied
level
optics, not Nature.
Okay, can I just ask my question just for the audience so they can hear it, Hugh? But the level of incompetence that you're suggesting is happening by multiple scientists, multiple credible peer-reviewed science journals. It's just not. How is that plausible? I guess is like, how are we to believe that?
Yes. No, I think it's because people don't actually read the papers. Now, I don't think we've got time, but if I go to what Morris, Schwalbe, and London actually wrote, we will find that they described they've got their table. Here's the table of all the numbers, which is precisely and very carefully written out. And with any luck, we will have a quote saying that the iron is extremely variable.
No, not extremely. It was mostly the area talking about was in the foot area, and we know that that's heavily contaminated. But they said in general, their conclusion was that they were not seeing a correlation between iron levels and image to pass the beer lamp.
They didn't say that.
But just
other people look at what they think they said and interpret it according to their own preconceptions.
So let me ask this.
What the scientists say. The scientists do not, in general, say things which are wrong.
No, their conclusions that there wasn't a correlation.
If there is this mismatch, so forget me and Teddy or pro-Shroud popularizers, but what would have to be wrong is that you would have to be saying the peer-reviewed the ones who did the peer review, the scientists, didn't read the paper because they didn't see that the conclusion was clearly contradicting the results.
Yeah,
Like,
this is what they wrote. Iron. Our measurements do reveal a non-uniformity in the background distribution of iron. Well, I agree with them. Now, why doesn't anybody else agree with them?
There are other areas.
Do you agree with them or not? Do you? This is a peer-reviewed scientific statement. It says our measurements do reveal a non-uniformity in the background distribution of iron.
There was something.
You're telling me that they were wrong, that you completely ignore the peer-reviewed statements, probably in, was it Applied Optics or something equally?
You're plucking something and kind of cherry picking something, but then twisting it because it's
reading
like it's like the thing you always like to say about the Morris and London thing, where like, oh, the iron correlates with image and it's from the foot, and that's they refer to that as being an aberration.
That's what I do say.
But then when you read the whole paper, the conclusion is the opposite of what you're arriving at and what you're making it seem like. And so it's like, that's why when I did that response on that show with Jack Marquardt, where we were going and we went, specifically into that particular issue that you brought up. And it's like, no, when you read the paper, the devil's in the details, but so is God. And so I don't know. I would have to, I mean, there's always just 10 million pieces of information when you're discussing the shroud. It's hard to ever have all of that just at the top of your head. But which
you
paper?
must get at it. You must demonstrate evidence. You mustn't say this is what happened or this isn't what happened. Right. You must write an article yourself with a very detailed description of exactly what you found, as you will find in my blog with the graphs taken directly from these people's data.
Which paper was it that you were just showing us that you were saying?
Oh, that was the Morris London and Morris Schwab and London paper.
And I seem to remember there was one of the papers, and that may have been it, where they were talking about issues with, while they were in Turin, something with forgot, how did they frame it?
Yeah.
Some sort of problem with the signal to noise, and they were going into that, and I think you might be using that to counts.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
But there were other things that then got into it where they do not see that that correlation in
plot the data yourself and see what you think.
Yeah, so that which one, the Morris and London one that you were just
Morris Schwab and London. Find those columns for iron, calcium, and strontium. Draw them all out on the line and see what happens.
So let me just read from their abstract. So this is what they say in the paper. Maybe I should share the screen so people can. Do you mind if I share the screen, Hugh?
Yeah. No, oh, sorry. No, I'll stop. Yeah, here we go.
All right. Just so that people. So there is. Okay. So hopefully that's popping up. Let me. Okay. So we present results of the X-ray fluorescence measurements on the Shroud of Turin. Quantitative estimates are given for the observed trace quantities of calcium, iron, and strontium, and detection limits are established for other elements of potential interest. So the calcium and strontium appear as uniform background distributions. Iron traces are observed in all the data spectra, so image and non-image areas, but their local concentrations vary. So it's not exactly.
And I think that's where, if I recall correctly, that's the paper they get into the foot area. That's what skewed things from what I recall.
Yeah,
There
and
are
look,
some interesting variations. Yeah.
comparisons between image and off-image areas reveal no differences within the precision limits of the data. That would indicate the presence of pigments or dyes containing high C elements, which iron would
Yeah,
qualify.
so right there, comparisons between image and off-image areas reveal no differences, blah, 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 that would indicate the presence of pigments or dyes containing high C elements, which of course iron constitutes one of those high C elements. And of course, with the blood stains, that's part of the reason why the iron levels are not uniform throughout the shroud, because when you go to the blood levels, they spike because there's iron in blood. So, but when you exclude the blood, that's where there's just a uniform level of, obviously when we're saying uniform.
Go back to the paper, exclude the blood, and see what differences you get.
Well, then, I mean, but
I'm not going to argue in my favor. I'm just going to say, go and have a look.
Okay, well, I have looked and right even with
Look again.
I will.
Look, for the audience, look in the comments. Teddy will have a 20-paragraph thing refuting you by the end of the day. So
Look, I've really got
you
to
gotta
go
go.
because the
No.
opening lines of this pantomime are my own, and they'll be getting
Oh,
worried.
well, break a
No
leg.
worries. Yeah, I want to
Cheers.
say thank you so much, Hugh, for showing up and defending your
Well, it's
hypothesis.
been fun. It's always fun when Teddy's around. So that I'm so grateful. Very good.
Oh, it was fun. I came
Were
in
you
kind of at the
surprised?
last minute, but
I was surprised and delighted, and I
well,
wish you
thank
both
you.
a very happy Christmas.
Well, thank you. Same to you.
Awesome.
Okay,
Merry Christmas,
bye
guys.
then.
All right.
Bye.